Mic test 1 2 3.
For the price, I mean, they're great for my wife. She doesn't use hers a ton. I use the heck out of mine.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, they're sweet. Yeah, you have a great company. That's good stuff.
Testing 1 2.
Oh.
Yeah, I did not know you were the superintendent. That I should know that.
You should just get
I'm not watching my profile. I do.
Just so you all know, we're streaming
Also
the
a big
meeting,
kid, I was just
so your
scrawny little
conversations are being streamed
kid,
right
and
now.
anyway, he had a talk.
Wished I'd have known that.
Yeah,
I would
stop.
have bet that.
Sorry, Superintendent.
Holy steak present. You never even brought it up.
All right, you're good to go.
Thank you, Jerry.
Come in for an interview.
You're still missing a few people.
And I didn't.
How far of a drive is it for you?
It's about 50 minutes.
It makes sense that you fully go where you went right
It's just
to
up over the hill.
the,
Yeah, that's true.
So it's,
to the destination,
Nice
like
drive.
maybe that's where
Well,
it
it-
started, that was the worst.
it snows there when it doesn't snow the other
Look,
place.
it's only
It hasn't been bad
hard
this
class.
winter by all means.
Yeah.
Look, you can't even drop
Yeah, we're gonna pay for
But
that, I
everybody's
think, in
nice
the next
and-
couple months.
in
I don't know.
Hurt the moisture.
Yeah,
Sit in a circle, sing kumbaya.
Oh,
It's interpretive, your art's good, his art's good.
Yeah.
yeah. Everybody's definition of what's good. It's okay.
Well, it seems like it only gets some more, so.
Were you up at the booth? You had a cool shape?
Yeah.
In art class. I think I might have stepped on it. Me and my boy came and shot you guys air props. That's what you had.
Most people like that.
Yeah, Dan shot that on. No, we use the heck out of your stuff, and Tad's always talking really good about you guys.
Why
Like, you
didn't
might
you pick
visit
up
a
John?
couple times. See
Tad,
him.
I should have.
Well, I'm off today, so I wasn't Yeah.
He's cleaning.
Doing phone scope stuff, or are they doing something?
No.
Yeah, we had my son got married last night, so
Wow.
Napa's.
today
Yep,
is
yep, okay.
the
Pick up
day
everything.
after clean up everything day.
So you lucked out then.
Sort of.
Yeah, Cedar's a good place.
Tough choice.
We enjoyed our time there.
So he
This
has
meeting at the State Board of Education at 8 o'clock this morning.
8 to 5.
I'll be gone all day.
Yeah, I noticed he's been out here in the parking lot.
No,
Wow.
he's just, it's a problem
Clean
solver.
up
Oh,
stage
okay.
isn't really as bad as the build up
So
stage.
when somebody gets mad, he goes back and fixes it. So
Good.
Sometimes have a lot of
They
help
still,
tearing
they
down.
still pay him to just take the problems. So he spends a day or 2 months going around cleaning up. years.
How long ago did that
Yeah.
go? Are they still in
You
this?
don't care what it looks like.
They got back last
It's all going in.
Saturday.
That's how my
No,
buddy.
they got back Sunday.
Sunday.
Yep.
We don't segment ourselves at all, do we? Should we scoot?
Hey, we do.
Nice job, nice job. Should we scoot? We want to, well, power strip, that's why.
I assume Don will
We
be
got a
here.
crew
Are we
to
missing
get our
some
own.
people?
And Derek's not here, John's not
Derek?
here, Superintendent Nelson's not, or Larson.
Do you think that, because the original,
3.
the original letter had it
Boys,
at
And
2?
two.
And a daughter.
Cool.
So.
Oh, did I have
my,
it too?
Yeah.
middle
The
boy,
original-
The original
he does
said
all the
May
hydro
18th,
dipping and
2 to
graphics,
5.
everything, and he,
Oh.
Does he live up here?
So when you moved it to 1,
Okay,
I'm hoping
was
it
gonna
was
say,
1
I
to
thought Ted said
4.
it was up here somewhere.
Sure.
Yeah, he
It depends on how quickly
Or
we.
1 to 3.
1 to 3.
And stays 3 or 4 days, works, and he drives back.
Right.
He likes living, he's a city.
See, it's the directors that keep me on my toes.
And now you-
No, we're here.
They point out all the details I forget. That's good.
No, she's actually married
here
in
on time.
Phoenix.
Oh, for
So,
sure.
Well, that's a
So,
great,
was
isn't
her husband
it?
doing
I
that?
have to get my stuff on time, I have to do all the things on
Yeah.
time.
That has to be.
Yeah, that's.
So they're actually, they're just.
Yeah, we approved, getting a transportation
So they just left. Just
category
now.
on our website.
Drive up here to go
Instead of
to
going
Charlotte,
through finance,
drive back.
pupil
It's not worth it.
transportation. We can now go to pupil transportation, which how it was before.
Easier to find.
Yeah, and I'm working on getting things uploaded to the website.
You said like a month ago you're ready to send standards out. I haven't seen it yet. Come on, what are you doing?
At least getting the website. Balance.
Because I harass him all the time.
I know.
That's all you're doing is do
Um,
business.
Risk management just got back with me with their review of the state standards. And so I am doing that final update. Standards, I thought were pretty much ready. Actually went through the appendix as well. So as we went through the appendix, we referenced a lot of codes and laws. So we moved those to the standards.
Okay.
And the appendix has the additional items. So we just did a revision. Pat emailed it to me yesterday, and so I haven't had a chance to update with risk management. And I have it being reviewed by our special ed department. And I'm getting ready to get it sent out to UDOT. They have a director of motor carrier operations that to review our portions of state standards and our regulations. So I'm planning to probably get this update out, get it to Herb, and then just make sure we.
So did state risk or special ed make any significant changes?
Special ed I haven't got the report yet. Risk, it was more like,
I think he spent like 450 bucks a month.
just minor changes, if we repeat this
So I showed
twice,
him your website and stuff like that, but.
take some of that out.
It's, he's got vortex stuff.
Change
He's
these
got
words
vortex
to,
stuff.
Well,
these
just the
words.
adapters and stuff, I mean.
Shall we, May?
Yeah, you guys do sell that stuff through Vortex.
Pretty
You
significant.
used to have some of the cases and stuff like that on there. Do you do that?
I think it was.
No, they
This is a word maker.
decided they didn't want
And when we take
this
portions of
disputed.
different
Oh, really?
things,
Yeah. So this
like he
is-
noticed some of the ideas didn't flow very
It was all
well,
labeled,
so we had me just change
Yeah.
a few words so that
And they just
it
says,
acts like you're reading
you know, we're
a
showing
continuous piece.
high dollar.
So, I think it's good.
Well, he bought your attachment.
Found some things we did,
Showing
so.
that online and.
We're pushing to
He's like,
Why
"I was
is
trying
that?
to find
60-day
something."
trial
He's
out
like,
and
"I can't."
get it
And I like
approved,
looked
and
at
then,
the class, but
I'm teasing you, because I know you've been finishing up classes for tech, and yeah, you've
I've
been
got some other
busy.
stuff made too that.
He hasn't got here. By the time it comes out, that'll be time
It
to
was all
start again.
NASCAR last summer.
Oh,
Had a
really?
car and everything.
And I'm already like,
Actually,
I'm already finding
they
things
told
that
500.
could be
No
added in,
way.
and I'm just like, okay, we're just approving this, and then we'll
And the
move
product
forward
that-
with.
that
Hang on to 'em.
we invented.
So the
Yeah.
question came up in March in St. George about travel between like 1 and 4, and somebody was like, I'm pretty sure there's a risk thing on it. There is. Bruce Siegel sent it down, and I finally have, took it to Kent Peterson, VA, and please. So they're writing a whole travel administrative memorandum about, and including that in there.
So, and I just got that this week as well. So he came back with me with the edits, We talked about splitting up what's the law. Law is, or we moved to standards, but they're coming up with a best practice, and then I'll have them review it one more time with just what we recommend.
Recommendations.
Yeah, because school bus is excluded on some of the motor carrier rules, but we still suggest that we follow those rules that have been designed in place for safety.
Can you guys share a mic? Ours is yours on?
I just turned mine on.
I won't use
didn't
it,
wanna
so you
be-
can
You know
take
what?
it.
You can take all the numbers now. Take them all.
Well, thanks, everybody.
I'll pass you a note if I need it.
Okay, so we're gonna use the mics because we're recording and streaming, and in the event that someone's listening online, we don't know right now if anyone is. But if you make a comment, people online can't hear you if you don't use the mic. So since we only have 3 that are working, if you need to say something, please let us know. I'm going to turn the time over to Jamie to kind of go over the agenda. And I think, first of all, we wanted everyone to kind of go around and introduce yourselves and just tell us who you're from and or where you work and what organization you represent. And just before we forget, thank you so much for spending your time to come up and participate in this group. We know that this is an important issue. It's one that we want to get resolved before a report is required for Public Ed Appropriations Committee in August. So, Ron, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm Ron Litchfield. I'm the State Pupil Transportation Specialist here at the State Board of Education, and glad to be here.
I'm Herb Jensen, the Transportation Director from Jordan School District.
Wayne Reese, Transportation Director at Cache and Bullitt.
Allison Bullitt, I'm the transportation supervisor in Iron County.
Kyle Hostler, Business Administrator, San Luis School District.
Tracy Davidson, Superintendent from Garfield.
Ben Lishman, Legislative Fiscal Analyst for K-12 Education.
Lexi Garrison, Financial Manager with the Board of Education.
Jamie Barrett, Minimum School Program Administrator. Natalie Grange, Assistant Superintendent of Financial Ops. So we're missing 2 superintendents and 2 business administrators, is that correct? So we're missing Kent Larson from South SMP and Rick Nelson from Nebo from the superintendent side. And we're missing Derek from Uinta and John Larson from Jordan, who are representing the BAs. So thanks, transportation folks, for getting here. We appreciate it, and thanks, Ben, for coming as well, so that we can have these exciting conversations. So, okay.
Why we're having this work group basically is due to the fact of Public Education Appropriations Subcommittee this last session. The UASBO and USSA group brought forth legislative requests to increase transportation roughly about $4 million. Is that their request? I can't remember. So, and there was discussion about exactly what percentage of costs are actually reimbursed or funded through the to from school pupil transportation formula. And the state had one number and the LEAs had a different number. And so we're just trying to make sure through this work group that we educate how exactly the formula works, so everyone's on the same page about what it includes, how it gets to the exact percentage that our school districts are funded from the to from school pupil transportation formula, and how that 85% plays into from statute, and what we do in the case of LEAs that are actually above the 85% threshold. And so that's one of the main objectives from here, and then just some of the questions that I'm hoping that this work group can discuss and hopefully provide some recommendations. As a state agency, we have the opportunity to present to the Public Education Subcommittee, I believe on August 14th, any recommendations from this committee group about the funding formula for to from school pupil transportation. So that is our end objective, is having some recommendations for that committee. I hope everyone had a chance to watch the tutorial video, and I hope that first we'll go through any questions from that video on how the actual formula functions. We're also going to discuss the difference between the state's measurement of 85% and what the LEAs presented the 85% to be, and then just some of the questions that we're hoping to get answers to or discussion with How will USB ensure that the legislature funds no more than 85% of the approved to/from costs? What does approved mean? How will the 85% be measured? Are all LEAs recording expenditures in the annual financial report consistently? Are we just including just to/from? Are we including all transportation costs? What is the purpose of reporting on the AFR? And how does the guaranteed transportation in the rural routes program interact with the to/from calculation? So let's begin with number one. Do we have any questions about how the actual function of the formula works? Do we want to discuss any of those points?
Did you all get a chance to look over the video and watch it? And
It was very helpful.
Yeah,
Thank
very
you.
good.
Explain it all.
Yeah.
thought you could take some pauses and absorb instead of trying to kind of take it all in one setting. I know one of the things that we wanted to bring out, and I don't know for all of you who may or may not have been present during some of the testimony in public education appropriations, effectively one of the issues that arose is when the fiscal analyst office asked us what percentage various LEAs were being reimbursed, we used the allocation or the calculation that's based off of the formula. The business administrators and USSA had done a rough calculation off of their total costs and their APR. And the difference between total costs and eligible costs is a large enough delta that it was causing significant issues when the percentage calculations were being applied. So I think that's one of the things that we wanted to highlight and just make sure everyone understands. The way we measure the percentage isn't really identified or called out in statute anywhere, but we do need to agree as to how we're going to measure that. And so that was one of the things we wanted to cover today.
As you go through your columns of how you're funding stuff, we're all, appears reporting stuff under different categories, different columns, different numbers. Is there going to be an expectation to make everybody try to migrate to the same way so that we can compare apples to apples, or is that not an issue at the state level?
So right now, and that's a really great question. I think that's one that if you don't do the reporting on a daily basis, you probably aren't aware of how that works. Right now, and we have always had a chart of accounts that tells our business administrators what codes to use for certain activities. So function 2700, transportation costs are supposed to go in that function. And you're correct, as I went through, and one of the items that I looked at was related to insurance costs, right? I would assume that a substantial part of the premiums or the insurance costs that our LEAs incur are related to transportation, right? That's a pretty risky area. That's one that most of you are covered by risk management. And I noted that not every district is coding something to insurance. That's not wrong, but you also don't get any credit for that towards your transportation costs. Does that make sense if you don't take the time to allocate them there? We know that there was a lot of email conversation around how people are using these object codes and what people are putting into these functions. There's no requirement that bus purchases have to be coded to to function 2700. And as you'll note, when we look through property purchases, there's not a lot of LEAs that are showing the costs associated with purchasing buses. And that's okay, because those we would just toss out anyway, right? Part of the formula is that we don't include capital purchases for buses in eligible costs. And so there are going to be some factors that LEAs do a little differently based on where they're booking or paying for expenses. But largely, my understanding, this is why I wish Brett was here, my understanding is that all of your day-to-day operations, your drivers, the aides, substitutes, jump in here, Ron, whenever you feel like it, pretty much anything related to the day-to-day activities of student transportation, whether that's to, from, or activities, should be recorded in this function code using the object codes outlined in the chart of accounts. This year we made some adjustments to the descriptions in the object codes. So the object codes are what how you book the expenditure, where you decide to classify an expenditure. One thing that we made adjustment for is for every object code or for every kind of object code, there was really specific things like motor fuel, parts, and then there were all over the place we had these codes called other, right? And we have a lot of codes. If we are going to have a code that says other, we want to take the time to figure out what it is that we're missing that's big enough that everybody's using. And so we eliminated other all over the place this year because we were finding that people were just using that as sort of a dumping ground instead of actually segmenting out their costs. And so one of the changes in the chart of accounts this year is you're not going to find other. So that will help in some of the issues. What else did we make a major change to? Travel. Most of our changes aren't really going to have much of an impact on transportation. I believe we created a new object code for bus aides. Is that correct? Because we heard that some of those other salaries were related to aides that are on the buses every day and are an integral part of transportation. And so we wanted to be able to segment those from those other miscellaneous things to actually represent the cost of those activities. We've tried to drill down with a little more specificity so that when questions arise about what we're booking or what LEAs are booking, we can answer them more consistently. But overall, there has always been an established chart of accounts that everyone should be following. So it's really just the anomalies that we should be trying to diagnose and fix. I think from our perspective, we feel like this is a pretty reasonable and relatively consistent way. Every LEA is required to follow this format and to report the same numbers. So that's why we use this as our base.
I think it's also important that this report actually takes in data from other reports. We have our summer to and from transportation reports. We look at those reports in our fall report, and we're trying to also promote making a video that we can share with districts on how those reports are put together, so we have consistency on the funding of the to from transportation side of this report, to make sure that's correct and done consistently across districts.
Will you scroll across to the average, the averages? As we sat and tried to figure out what we thought the important points were to discuss with the group, I think something that often gets lost in the spreadsheets, right, because it's real easy to get lost in these spreadsheets, are the fact that the first part of this calculation, the whole intent is A, to establish eligible costs, and B, to calculate averages, right? So as you can see, associated with every school district in column BC and in column BG, we're calculating out an average cost per mile or minute for each district. And depending upon how each district makes your individual decisions, whether you're providing benefits for your drivers, whether you have a different kind of fuel than another district does, every LEA has the opportunity to find efficiencies in their operations. And one of the explanations that I got a while ago when I started here was the reason that we fund everyone based on averages is to ensure that we're encouraging efficiency. Really the only internal control we have over, aside from reviewing your eligible bus routes and making recommendations or reducing miles and those kinds of things, is to hold everyone to some sort of standard of what our expectation is. So if you spend some time and kind of roll through these averages, there are some LEAs who have really high average cost per mile, and others who have really low. Sometimes those who have really low, especially in the realms of miles, it means they travel a lot of miles, right? When you have a pretty consistent cost and a ton of miles, when you divide that over a lot of miles, your cost is relatively low. Some of our LEAs that have a higher cost per mile, it's because you're not as big, you're not covering as much ground, they're not traveling as much, and so their costs look relatively consistent. I know we tried to do some comparisons between rural districts that were about the same size and big districts that were about the same size, and it kind of looked like they all kind of were relatively consistent. We didn't see any anomalies, right? Anybody who looked like they were way high or way low, but just keep in mind that sometimes when we calculate those averages, it's all dependent upon the data that goes into it. So for example, San Juan travels a ton of miles because San Juan district covers the entire bottom half of the state, where an urban school district that just covers, like Murray, I think was a good example, they don't cover a lot of ground. They're doing a lot of routes and they have kids, but they're not covering as much ground as San Juan, and so their costs look a lot higher. And a lot of the, is it miles or minutes? One is meant to represent variable costs, and one is meant to represent fixed costs. I think fixed is variable, right, or minutes? So whether if you have 5 buses and you drive them 300 miles a day, or you have 5 buses and drive them 20 miles a day, you still have to have 5 drivers, right? And so you have some costs that regardless of how far you're going, you're still going to incur those. Your gasoline costs, of course, or your fuel costs are going to vary depending upon how far you're going. I think maintenance costs are going to vary a little bit between LEAs depending upon the kinds of buses you have, the kinds of fuel, the age of the bus, your bus fleet, right? I'm sure Ron can talk about this more intelligently than I can. There's a lot of variables that kind of factor into into how much your LEA is paying for to, from, or the costs that are associated with your day-to-day operations. So one of the functions of this formula is we come up with an average. We threw out those who have, who are so different from everyone else that they would skew the average. So if you remember, Jamie talked a lot about, we tossed out, for purposes of calculating the average, we tossed out Ogden, Cache, and Logan, right? Because Cache and Logan share a bus fleet and share drivers between the two of them, correct? Is that right? And Ogden has hired an outside group. So their expenses are largely just contract payments. And they, because they're not being spread across and those costs aren't being allocated between miles and minutes to put that one cost into one area, it would have skewed the formula. So when we come up with your average cost per mile and your average cost per minute, the other thing that I think people forget when they're looking at the calculation is that even though, so we'll pick on Murray because they're not here, right? So Murray, their average cost per mile is $2.08. When we reimburse them or do their formula calculation for them, we're using the average cost, the $1.08. So that means essentially that Murray, with their local funds, are having to fund the other $1-ish of their cost per mile. Does that make sense? Where a district like Weber, where their cost per mile are 77 cents, they're effectively getting 33 cents more than it's costing them to go per mile. So the point of using the averages is it was supposed to incentivize those LEAs who were way above the average to find a way to bring their costs down if they could. And it was to effectively, I don't want to say benefit, but reward those LEAs who were able to bring their costs down and find efficiencies. And without that, if we just reimbursed everybody at their cost, there would be no incentives for the LEAs to find cost reductive measures, to be efficient, to plan your routes more effectively. I think all of you know, all of our LEAs know and understand that they're not paid 100% for their transportation. And I haven't found an LEA who's driving around with one kid on a bus. I know that that's a myth that's out there, that we drive around with 4 or 5 kids in a bus and they're empty all the time. That's not happening in our LEAs, at least to the things that I've seen. So I don't know if that helps. Are there parts of the formula you want to talk through?
Well, Natalie, that just caused me to have a slight question, because if you move up to San Juan, for instance, no, they're okay. I was wondering if there needed to be a factor in there for lots of miles used.
So San Juan's average is 73 cents a mile.
They're getting a benefit.
Right, so they're getting a benefit, or they're recovering more. Yeah, they're recovering more than the average.
We're definitely getting an uptick from the state average of using that one away.
Because I know that's been one of the concerns, at least with legislators, is making sure that our rural districts with large territories aren't disadvantaged through this formula.
We're not disadvantaged. Our disadvantage is having 8,000 square miles.
Right. That's something that's not in your control.
Well, if you threw out the education portion and took the activities portion, the cost is we're bearing the cost, just not, you're not bearing the cost of our bus driver, so.
Right. So that's a really good, that's one of the things that we had also talked about yesterday that we wanted to make sure to cover is where activities are. So the cost for activities, our expectation is not that every time you buy a gallon of gas, you allocate it between a to, from, and an activities pot, right? That doesn't make any sense. And you have the same drivers who are doing to, from routes and then do activities and then come back and do to, from routes. The total cost, and that's why it's really important to make sure that everyone understands that there is no other function code for transportation, right? We validated that. There's not an extra special hidden something somewhere. Your activity costs are included in your total cost that we start with. They're in the total base. They do get taken out when we back out the activity miles, which is one of those other reports that Ron was talking about. So do you guys want to talk through that right now? The activity piece? Whichever one of you guys.
Well, the activities, that's originally what that guaranteed transportation was for, was to help in activities, but the funding of that has been so stable, never increased. And so I don't know that, I think that's on just a base formula look, that's probably something that should be considered, is how are we treating the activity and the guaranteed transportation? Because I do think, just since there hasn't been any change in the program, that obviously the buying power of those dollars has been diminished in the last, I've been here 18 years and I don't think it's increased about $500,000. And so that is telling me that then the rurals with very large distances to travel are then hurt because they have to absorb that in the other side of the budget. And so I think you have to kind of look at them both from just a provision of educational services aspect. But yeah, here the natural focus is on to from, but it doesn't mean we can't look at the entire concept of transportation and make a change.
Well, and with the guarantee, right? We're guaranteeing off of a levy that doesn't exist anymore. Correct. So that whole concept of that formula is something that probably does need to be looked at.
That's what I was going to suggest, is that the guarantee, I don't think, is targeting what it used to. And it seems more reasonable to change the data inputs and move the formula towards activity miles in proportion to total versus tax effort, because that's not what it's hitting anymore.
I know this from Cash, a lot of our state playoff games are in St. George now, just because of the way the regions are set. And, you know, please correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the guaranteed transportation tax levy going to rural school districts who are also, you know, if anybody's getting over 85% of their to and from, isn't that also the rural school districts?
Yeah, here are the people that are getting that.
You know, we're seeing our cost for activity trips go up as well.
So which one is the guarantee?
And we don't benefit from the guarantee.
Right. So to me, that blends it that you need to have maybe some other formula to look into that takes in, similar to this is doing the average miles for your activities, and then you would, you know, whatever that pot of money is, if you're driving more for approved activities, again, that's something you'd probably have to define, then that you would get more money out of that program than someone who's, you know, within a region that's fairly well contained. I don't know how those regions play out in the state, you know, probably just due to size. It's your schools in Cache and Logan are fairly similar to the size of the schools down in Washington, so that's why you're playing together. Right. But it's not taking an effect.
We play nicely together.
That transit, you know, I mean, it's a long distance.
Well, there used to be the special transportation tax levy that was just for, and one of the allowable uses of that was for, you know, field and activity trips, so forth, and now that's been folded, I believe, into the
board local levy.
Board local levy, and so, you know, we're fortunate that Dell is kind to us in transportation and still helping us, but that can be used. That doesn't have to be used for field activity trips. The school district can use that, and I think probably some are using it elsewhere. What for good or bad?
Well, and as the rate floats up, it's the same issue that we have with the other guarantee programs on levies that don't exist anymore. As the rates float up, we don't adjust down for assessed valuation changes. And so the amount that an LEA has to demonstrate to be eligible for this continues to climb every year, and they have no control over that. So, I mean, that's a fundamental issue we've been talking about for a while and just haven't found a solution for. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions on the, where are we starting to apply the audit adjustments, and which tab is that on? Anybody have any questions about how that process works with audit adjustments and how we adjust your eligible transportation cost or eligible transportation expenditures or eligible miles and minutes? Does anybody want us to go over that?
You know, I did transportation for 10 years, 15 years ago. And I guess my question is, you know, I wrote some software back then, and there's several districts that are still using the software. Have you ever addressed, you know, an addition to Aspire or a standalone reimbursement for a certain program that gives you everything that you want, but also gives us everything that we want as far as.
That's one of the things that Ron has been brainstorming. We've wanted a system to enable LEAs to submit data to make this process faster. We haven't quite got there yet. So I think that that's something that is much nearer now than it was a few years ago. I don't know if it would be an Aspire solution.
The data that you get would be far better if it came from a central source than all of us submitting whatever it takes to balance the spreadsheet so that we can submit.
Right. We all agree that the spreadsheets are not the best way to gather information for anybody. There are a lot of LEAs that already have software programs that they're using to manage their transportation, and we definitely want to make sure, just like with Aspire, that we take into consideration those who have invested in other programs so that we build something that everyone could either use independently or import their data into so that they wouldn't have to change if they don't want to. That's something that, again, we haven't had the time or energy to go through and write the scope of work out as to what that would look like, to figure out what a cost would be, to figure out how to fund that. That's not something that we here at the board have funding for right now. So, but we've been brainstorming how we could approach that and what the best way would be to approach that with the Board of Education and also the legislature. We've kind of started drafting up a little plan, but I'm not sure if we'll be ready in enough time for the next legislative session. That's our goal. But.
It just looks like in today's world it would be an easier, faster solution.
Well, and I think it would enable us to help.
Having everybody have their own way they do it.
Right. I think it would enable us to come up with some standardizations. I know Ron gets a lot of phone calls about, well, where exactly do I measure? Where do I start measuring the 1.5 miles? Or, how long does this have to be? And I think if we had a standard software that everybody used the same thing, it would be easier for us to employ some internal controls. But
so Melly, am I wrong? So there's the method the districts report that might be helpful to synchronize, but there's also the process the districts use to gather.
Right.
And that gathering is all over the board, from a paper and a pencil and a ruler to draw the lines to
software.
We're using GPS in our district, and I don't think anybody else is using GPS to gather the to and from data. Most of them are using, I think, routing programs.
We use GPS too.
Do you?
Well, the routing programs include GPS in it. Yeah, so I think most of us are using GPS to gather it.
Together or verify?
Either or both.
I just think that would be advantageous for you to do what you're going to do and allow us use of it.
Yeah, we've talked just briefly about expanding it to our driver records, which our district administration staff sometimes spend 20% of their time of the year doing state reports, and so that's a big challenge for districts. It was for me when I was a director, and finding the time, and
it's expensive.
Sometimes the reports are the busiest, fall sports, and it's always been a challenge. So trying to find something that works and is simplified enough that we can produce the records we need and facilitate districts and how they receive and report their data. And a database could also, right now we're doing a snapshot one day of the year funding for your school district when, I've talked to a lot of districts that add 3 or 4 routes during the school year and can't even address that growth till the following year, which would be another challenge. So.
I have a simple question. How long has this spreadsheet been going? Is it modified all the time, or has it been this way forever, or
It's a really good question.
So when Ron and when we got here, I've been here about 3 years, and Ron, a couple of months.
January.
When we went back, we tried to dig back several years, and I think it was at least 5 or 6 years ago a change was made, And then that's what we've been using ever since then. But I know that as I've talked to other people that have been here longer, that the formula has changed probably a handful of times over a 20-year period.
Is that an equalization within the department, or was that something driven by legislation?
I know some of it was driven by legislation. And then other things is just as stuff change within the transportation environment, things need to be modified within the formula in order to meet those changes.
So specifically, this report or similar reports we found on the computer, or our servers back 2012, and we're able to do some comparisons from 2012 to current. So at least that much has been pretty much the same, other than there's been a few adjustments for the capped funding of 85%, 100%, and caps removed.
Everything else has stayed relatively consistent. I know that as Ron and Jamie have been kind of looking through the transportation formula, and Brian and Jackie and Matt were kind of working on that before Ron got here. We had a lot of questions about needing to formalize some of the policies or the verbal authorizations that have been given on the phone. So some LEAs have an interpretation of one set of data points in the A1, and others use it differently. And so to your point, making sure that we have clear written instructions as to what this column in the A1 is actually supposed to be and how you're supposed to measure it is one of Ron's. That's one of the first, after he gets the standards manual done, the things that they'll be working through is making sure that we have standardized definitions for all of those reports so everybody's doing the same thing. I think that's going to take a little bit of time because we obviously want to find out what people are doing before we start making or changing anything. But I know we've had enough questions on things. We have enough people calling and asking us for interpretations that it feels like some of those data points need to be better defined. So that's not the objective of today. If there are items, or of these work groups, if there are items that you're aware of that we need to address, that's definitely something to hand over to Ron. But that's an ongoing project that we've been working on for a little while, is making sure we standardize those. So. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? Can we go to where you calculate the percentage and just talk through that?
Oh, which one?
So can you walk through, you know how we talked about what the final eligible costs are back and forth between the APR and how we do the percentages?
So I'll go back to here. So a lot of our LEAs are taking this $120 million number here as the total cost for transportation, and then figuring out what their total costs that they're submitting on the APR, dividing that by what their actual funds they're receiving, and getting a much lower percentage than what is shown right here. When we presented to the state, to the legislature, at least all of our districts are showing at least 80% being funded from for fiscal year 18. When we add this $30,000 base to everyone, that's when we start seeing districts anywhere from 81% to 200%, because that's pushing them over the threshold. How this works is we take the eligible costs from the final miles a minute cap, times that by the, I forget, my cursor's not in the right spot on here, times that by the average statewide cost. We do the same thing for the minutes, times that by the average cost here. We're adding in lieu and getting a total eligible approved cost for every school district. Because the total of this column here to pay 100% of those eligible costs is $96 million, my appropriation for fiscal year 18 was $78 million. So we prorate everyone down. And so then that leaves everybody at exactly the same percentage funding, 80.83%. Adding the base gets me to column 9, and this is where, I can't go over anywhere, but this is where we've got everybody arranged from at least 81% funded to the 205, I think is the highest.
So if you look in column I7, so that's Alpine's eligible cost, which is $12.4 million. Those are eligible based on all of their eligible routes. We've taken out miles and minutes associated with routes that aren't eligible. We've taken out activity miles. We've taken out auto
Training.
adjustments, training. So we go to the APR for Alpine. Really, this is the crux of the difference between the data we were using to come up with a percentage and the data that the BAs and the USSA came up with. So if you look at Alpine's total cost just on the APR, they're reporting $14.6 million. They're in AU7, that's 14,657,725. So that's about a $2 million difference between what they're reporting as total costs and what we're saying are eligible costs. And the differentiation, so what we've been able to calculate, or what we think we've been able to calculate, is that when the LEAs represented what the percentage are that they're getting funded, they use that $14 million of their total costs in comparison to the money they received. And that's how they calculated their percentage. When we calculated our percentage, we used eligible costs, because technically that's what the statute pays for, is what eligible costs are. So we would calculate the total we funded everyone by the $12 million to $12.4 million. And that's one of the major differences between the percentage that we represented and discussed in public ed appropriations and the percentage that the LEs were representing that they had been funded. It's probably roughly the same difference between everybody, but it's just using different data to come up with those calculations. Neither one is wrong, but if we're going to come up with a standardized measurement where we hold everyone to the same standard, we felt like the eligible cost should be the measure that we would go for. So,
Is there any move to, base it off of efficiency? And I guess what I'm saying is anywhere in the formula now or in the future there's going to be a factor based on how many students are actually on the bus for that mile? Because a route in a subdivision is far more effective than a route to a small town 20 miles away.
how would you hold constant? How would you hold constant the circumstance between urban and rurals?
Well, because almost every rural is going to be a few students, a lot of miles, and all the urban is going to be a whole bunch of students in a short number of miles. And it's probably would hold consistent.
And you don't think the average does that?
I don't know. That's why I was wondering if you had ever addressed that, if there was a need for a distance, because the cost theoretically could be the same, since it's a bus driver, it's a bus, and it's, the cost of operation, but the influence on the number of receptors of the services is far different.
Right now, number of students doesn't play a factor in the formula at all. With the caveat that a route isn't eligible if it doesn't have a 10, is it 10 students on a route?
Or 5 IEPs, right?
Or 5 special education students, right? So that's really the only place that number of students being transported.
So that's your form of equalization right there?
Have to think about that.
There's another area that, you say that buying buses is not part of the eligible cost. But the problem with that is that you take those that are in a subdivision, those that are going to town, they're putting on a lot more miles than rural. So the bus miles, per bus are so much higher. And yet there's not really a lot of programs that allow for extra bus purchases. So it's got to come from somewhere.
I know that the legislature specifically took out the capital cost of busing from the formula. And that's why we excluded, as the legislature directed that. I don't remember when. Do you know when, Ben?
It was in the downturn, and it actually came after an audit. There was a legislative audit in 2008 that basically said that, so there used to be a depreciation allowance in the formula, and then the audit came out and said that there was no tie to the depreciation and the actual depreciation of the buses, and that they couldn't, and so districts were keeping buses longer and basically using the money for something else instead of replacing the buses. And so it come with that and a budget cut that needed to happen. It just kind of came up that was what would be taken out. About $8 million was taken out of the formula that was at that time being paid for depreciation. allocation. I don't know that there's objection to putting it back in if the case could be made now. But that's kind of the last real change to the formula that I remember. So the reasonings were kind of, I mean, I think the audit just kind of came at a good time when they were looking for that was a place to cut.
I just wonder.
You know, from a political perspective.
Depends on your perspective.
Right, from a political perspective, it was a good time to, oh, here's
We
something
see
that
it
we
as a
can
bad
do.
time.
Yes.
Yeah, but at the same time, who did that hurt?
Right.
Unfortunately, when you're going to budget cuts, and those districts that are more reliant on state funds are the ones that are going to feel the bigger pain in that cut, and oftentimes that's your small rurals.
Yep. One of the problems I think that you have on the variable of maybe an average cost per student per mile is your variability of students. For a couple of years, you might be static and hold pretty same to the same or similar routes that you would run, but within that 2 to 3 year period, you might have a kid move to a different school or attend a different school, so that maybe equivalates on a different bus route. So
That would change a lot less than the bus route changes.
That's
So I
true.
have problems with that.
yeah, that's true.
I have another perspective being in Morgan School District. Morgan had a lot of routes that were rural around the highways and Mountain Green, which is more city. And when I had to set up my routes there, I had to set up my routes by time. I couldn't pick up kids in Morgan and still meet the school bell schedules because of distance.
Right.
And I, for the most part, would have 60% filled buses there. And then when you look at Mountain Green, I had 20-minute shorter routes, and I had at least 90% on every bus in Mountain Green. And so there's just those dynamics of how your district's set up, or a mix of those on your long stretches of road where you're picking up kids. It'd be hard to manage efficiency just because you don't have the time to have a full capacity bus on some of the rural routes.
And that's what I'm referring to. Some of those, we have an 8 to 10 mile stretch where a kid graduates and moves to a different school, and all of a sudden that's cut out of our route. So when you shrink those mileage based on the number of kids you're going out to actually pick up, that's something that varies quite often every year, at least for us.
Well, one of the areas where that really reveals itself, that we really take a serious hit, I think all districts probably do, and that is in the area of transporting preschool children.
Yep.
Because we don't have time to fill a bus with preschool children and get them. And so a lot of our bus routes that the school district has to pay, and it costs the same if you're driving a bus with a driver that's clear full, but you might only have 4 or 5 kids on the bus because they don't go Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You have students assigned to that bus, and some of them go Monday, Wednesday, some go Tuesday, Thursday, some go Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. And many of our preschool routes, I think you would agree, the districts are not getting reimbursement for those, but we're required to.
Well, they're not
provide those.
eligible, right? So
Preschool's not kindergarten.
special education preschool
Yeah,
would
that's
be
what I'm
eligible, a
talking about.
reimbursable one, but not special education preschool, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm referring
Yeah.
to as special education preschool. And we're required to provide that funding, but it's impossible for us to put enough students on a bus because we don't have the time to gather, to pick up enough to make that route eligible, and that's a huge expense to us, at least it is to me.
It goes back to the snapshot of one day of the year. So the day that we snapshot that, I may only have 4 kids on Tuesday and Thursdays, but come March, I'm full. So do I snapshot it? When do I snapshot it? Do I pull it from March?
It's supposed to be snapshotted in November, right?
Yes.
On November 1st.
So I've added 2 preschool routes this spring.
We use the first part of October because it takes so long to gather the data that's going to be reported on November 1st.
Right.
Well, and I think from our perspective, we definitely do not want to increase the frequency until we have a system that mitigates the time and energy it takes to gather and compile data. It's already hard enough. I can't imagine trying to make it more frequent without making other changes. So I think from our perspective, we're not encouraging that until we can fix some things here.
Jamie, I'm not trying to go,
But that would be another reason why it would be great if we had some kind of a centralized database that recorded the daily eligibility from everybody in the state. I know that's a vision way down the road, but that would make it so we wouldn't even have to spend all of the time that we have to spend gathering the data to put in here. It would be there already. And
Well, I know
just-
we had to manually roll some of those reports to send them out to you, and we were done after doing that. So I don't, a system would enable that automatic roll, and you could just update or modify, which is one of the reasons we started. That was the core of the reason why we started having conversations about that. So it's just the funding aspect and being able to sustain the program and getting it all spec'd out to create it. But that's definitely, I know that's something that had been on the list of things to do for a long time. And I think that we're now in a place where we can start having those conversations about putting systems together that actually interact. We've had conversations about maybe we should feed students from U-Tracks, right? So you wouldn't have to populate kids. Like, we've had a lot of conversations about interoperability and how do we best utilize the systems we have and create route maps and things for you guys. So we haven't made any decisions, just so you're aware. We're just talking about what would be really awesome to have, not how we're going to get there.
But that would be a good request from the legislature, because we've done it everywhere else. We've built central database for adult ed, we've built central database for students. We've done everything, but we still are in the same spot we were 20 years ago.
Yeah, we've been working on a plan. But I think from our perspective, in order to make sure that that's a reasonable, doable plan, we have to understand what the specifications need to be. And right now, between this and getting the standards manual out, we haven't quite got there yet. So that's sort of the next part of our progression. Are there any questions about how the percentages are calculated?
I do, because I actually ran this calculation where I took on your first tab your total average cost per mile a minute. Then I actually added some extra rows, and then I took that 14 million and I backed out anything that it would be considered non-allowable that didn't have your highlighted green, orange, or blue. And I don't come up with the same 12 million that you have on your final allocation. One more tab, final allocation. Right there, that's highlighted.
So did you go through and adjust the eligible miles and minutes?
Yeah.
For the proration.
Okay, so it's the proration that's
Yeah.
looking at. Okay, so which then it has my other question on, which is that proration formula of the average. And this is, I think we touched on it. To me, I think what it's doing is it's not even taking into a lot of factors that need to come into play, where some LEAs have a pool of people and large swaths of people that they can pick and choose from to hire, so they don't have to offer things that other districts have to offer. Or when you have somebody that's trying to compete with the oil field, or you have somebody that's to just take the lowest average when you have some people that can offer nothing, which then drops that average, it crushes pretty much everybody else. By looking at it without taking any weighted average and just taking the total amounts, there's only 2 districts that are above the 80%, and only 5 that are even within 10%.
So right now, your average cost per mile is $1.04, and the statewide average is $1.08, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So you're actually getting paid at the $1.08, not at your $1.03.
But our minutes, if you look at our minutes, right,
We're
we're double.
Well, you're 64 compared to 90 cents.
So your local funds are having to pay the 30 cents above the 64 that you're getting.
So, but that's when you look at the average, if you take off the average factor that you guys have at the 183 and the 64, and you actually fund and just say, okay, whatever they're getting versus go over a couple columns to the total, and then back out what is allowable expenses. There's only 2 districts in the state that are above 80%, and 5 that are at 70% or above. And so that factor is actually, I think, hurting a lot of districts.
So you missed us talking about why we do that. Our understanding of why we use that average factor is to create an incentive for our LEAs to be efficient in their practices, so that we don't end up with buses with 2 kids on it or 3 kids on it, or numerous routes. If we paid everybody 100% of their costs without an internal control, and I think the internal controls are harder to envision in these circumstances because it's just such a mammoth activity. I know that our auditors used to like drive around and follow routes in a car, right? I can remember hearing about that. I was never around when that happened, but our auditors used to drive around and follow buses and like clock them with a stopwatch and like do the mile, right? Didn't they like see how far the miles and the stops were?
Front door.
Right, and
You
that.
had a bus lose the auditor.
Oh, you lost them all. Nice. So I know that in lieu of a lot of the necessary manpower that would be required to do that kind of auditing, they moved more into some of the analytical tools. Is that fair? I mean, I think that's where some of the transitions, and that's why some of the averages were employed to encourage LEAs who were higher. I mean, we kind of went through some LEAs who have a higher cost per mile than others. It's because they're traveling a lot more miles, or they have a smaller number of students that they're spreading those across. And yeah, you're right. I mean, if we paid everybody at their high costs or at their lower costs, the issue would be that you would still, basically what would happen at this point though is it would just redistribute money between LEAs. Mm-hmm. Like that's not going to generate an increased appropriation from my perspective. And so I think without a lot of back information about how they came up with the averages, we don't really have any information about how this formula came about. It looks to us like it does. There were a few that were, you're right, there are a few that are really high. The ones we looked at were all rural. So like Murray has a really small concentrated area. They have a lot of kids, but they don't travel very far. Versus San Juan that has a significant span of space that they're traveling and not as many students. And so the miles and minutes are going to fluctuate.
So Natalie, just in the transportation trenches, one thing I've heard for years is that because we're all in the same pie of money and all the data submitted, and what happens from our perspective is that a district who is more efficient and has more tiers on their bus schedule, or their buses are fuller or whatever, tends to get a little, and then another district, isn't as efficient, but the whole state is sharing in both, in the inefficiency and in the efficiency. And so the incentive is not so much for the district to compete against themselves to be to be efficient. It's well, whether if they're doing that, then I think the efficiency would be a lot better if our efficiency was based on how we're doing against ourselves instead of everybody else. And I think that could be happening in a way, whether it's a rural school district or an urban school district as well.
That leads in, and I've been kind of contemplating here in my mind a little bit, based on some prior conversations we've had that I've had with legislators on this. And how much do you think, as district people, the way the formula is structured encourages you to be efficient, just because of you're trying to maximize your benefit under the formula? Or is it, again, just more that you want to be more efficient on your case, basically just more efficient than, basically self-induced efficiency?
I think any district is ultimately wanting to be more efficient because they know that the more efficient they become, it's a reduction in cost that goes back to their general fund.
Right.
Right? I mean, I would gladly change the way that we do things to be more efficient if it was an easy bullet. I know that I have routes that are an hour and a half long, and they're not even in a full bus. Whereas you have a district here in the local area, their 20-minute route is full like that. okay? They can be way more efficient than I ever could dream about being. And so, and so it.
But that's not because you're choosing to not fill a bus, it's because of it's
The
because of the
environment.
geography and where your children are spread around.
Yep, absolutely.
Things you can't control.
And so-
But a way to look at that is that, you know, our bus miles aren't necessarily to and from school. Our bus miles are everything combined, and so we address efficiency. We're looking at it at 50 or 55% of reimbursement, not 80% of reimbursement. So we make a lot of money by being efficient, so we're forced to be efficient. We can't afford not to be efficient.
Well, these conversations I've had is basically, why are we wasting all our time and effort on tracking miles, minutes, buses, and all of that? Why don't we just do an allocation based on some other factors, you know, whether that's a base plus 1, 2, 3 formula that takes in, you know, the number of kids in kindergarten, grades 1 through 12, and necessarily existent, and just do a flat distribution to districts and leave the whole efficiency up to you.
Well, that would work, but you can't use kids because there's no, it takes the same to transport one as it does to transport.
Right, and that's basically
48.
what the theory of the nest would bring that in, is you would get a benefit under the formula because you would have more, in theory, nest qualifying schools.
Plus, there's the,
But not necessarily more.
there's the
money.
data now that every district has available to them if they have a routing program. It has the exact mileage. It's easy for school districts to submit to the state the exact mileage that every student in the state of Utah lives from the school they attend. And so you back out the mile and a half, the K6, and then 2 miles, and you can know. And so those rural school districts who those kids live out there, that increased mileage could be part of that factor of see, I feel like we're trying to, this to me is like we're trying to fund the time of the teacher. You know, how much do they spend instruction, how much, instead of the student. And I think there's a much simpler way to do it. And I apologize, Natalie, I didn't mean to go there today.
Well, I know that we actually did some investigation into that a while ago, about 2 years ago, when we did the intent language report, and not every LEA has that software. So if we had that software, if we had a statewide software where everyone was measured consistently, you're right, we would have better data to make decisions, but we don't have that statewide.
You don't have to have a routing program. We pulled it up, we can do it with a routing program, and you can also do it with an ESRI. ESRI was given to any school district. You get it for free a few years ago. I don't know if they still do it, but it has the ability to do that as well, and gosh, it'd take a lot less time and effort than what we're doing. But that's just my opinion, I apologize.
Well, that would give you one aspect of the formula, is how far a student is away from the school. But we'd still have to come up with an average amount that we'd reimburse every LEA per student. And you'd have to have cost factors to be part of that. And that's where I think that you're still going to end up in the APR in some fashion, trying to pull data out of there. Whether we do it by miles or minutes or student, you're still going to have cost be a factor.
Like you do the WPU, you'd have a cost per student, cost per mile per student. You'd also have to have, we know that special ed students cost more, like they do in the classroom. You can have an add-on for special ed students, and yep, your AFR or APR would have to still be used, but it sure made my life easier, and that's what I'm all about.
Any other areas? Can we talk about the base?
Can you go over the I was just gonna ask if you could go over the prorated allocation, Jamie. You went over that, but I missed it, went over my head the first time.
This one?
Yeah, column 6. How did we get column 6? Tell me how you went.
Okay, so eligible miles.
Yep.
Right, eligible minutes, times those by the average state rate.
Okay.
Plus in lieu, gives me the total approved or eligible.
You're not in the right place.
Oh, I hate this TV. Sorry, I need a Vanna. Gives me column 5. Okay, and then because 100% of eligible costs in our state costs $96.8 million. My appropriation is only 78.2, so I have to prorate everybody down.
Okay.
So column 6 is the proration down, which means that in effect, everyone's paid at 80% of their costs.
Okay.
Eligible costs.
Eligible costs.
So column 2, the submitted A1 eligible miles after final. So we go through an audit process. We pull out activity miles, right? We disallow routes. We go through an audit process and make an adjustment to the miles that were submitted. And so that column is reflective of that process. Same with the minutes one.
Right.
Right, we go through and adjust
Which is
miles and
this.
minutes from the A1 based on how close people came to their estimates. If we find routes that only have one kid on them, right, like we go through and find, in the past couple years, we've found a lot of school of choice routes, and we've disallowed those for lots of reasons, but we've been disallowing those. We had some issues with fueling stops and stuff this year, I think. I can't remember all the details on that, but so if you go back to those two. So those two yellow columns, 2 and 3, are then what is multiplied against the statewide average. So if you go back and look at Alpine's A1 report, it's likely that the $2.9 million or 2.9 million miles isn't what they submitted. We might have made an adjustment to that. There are some circumstances when we add miles too, right? Sometimes we find that the miles weren't counted appropriately, or there was a part of the mile calculation that wasn't applied correctly, or their formula was messed up in the spreadsheet. And so we add miles sometimes, and we take miles away depending upon those audit adjustments. Once you come up so that the column number 5, that $12.4 million, that's a calculation. That's column 2, Alpine's $2.9 million times the $1.08, and the $14.3 million times the 64 cents, plus the total amount of in lieu gets you to the 12.4. So it's not a matter of going back to eligible costs and just subtracting stuff from the columns, right? This is a calculation. And that's why I think sometimes it's difficult for LEAs to understand how we get from the APR to what we're determining as eligible costs. The APR is a data point that creates a calculation. I don't know if that helps.
Allie?
Yes?
Is that 100% of what's reported?
Mm-hmm. So we have been making some changes to in lieu in the past couple of years. That's another area where Ron will be doing some work as we kind of get our feet wet around this. We were finding in some cases that some of our in lieu payments were being claimed in 2 or 3 different places. The stuff, I think, are we still using a separate form for in lieu? We stopped that, right?
No, it all comes off the APR.
So about 3 or 4 years ago, the in lieu form was separate, right? And we were filling out that in lieu form. Sometimes we found that the LEAs had already recorded those in lieu costs in the APR. So if we were paying you for them here and we recorded they were in the APR, they're getting counted twice, right? Some LEAs had costs in the in lieu associated with like students that we were paying housing for, or tuition if we were sending them across the border. But that's already getting reimbursed in another place within the minimum school program. And so by leaving that in here, we were paying for it twice. So the good thing about us kind of reviewing formulas is we were finding that there were inconsistencies across how those are being applied statewide. And so we fixed those. I think we feel pretty okay about what's in lieu right now, especially since we're taking it off the APR. But we're not entirely sure if all the LEAs are recording everything there that should be there. And so making sure we accurately define what that's supposed to mean and what it's supposed to capture, I think will help our LEAs ensure that they recover everything that's possible. But yeah, that's at 100%, right?
Was there an increase in the in lieu payments as far as the amount of money that was available if the formulas changed for what we're getting off of bus routes?
I don't think I understand the question.
So is it in statute that it says to take a percentage of a percentage? Because as I look through that, there's not a single district that looks like that their estimated costs are higher than their actual submitted costs. And so that's I think partly why a lot of districts are saying there's no way we're getting 80%, because it's essentially a percentage of a percentage.
But do those costs include activities and other things that are ineligible and to from?
But but even on that one, like right there, those are actual ones that you guys have got that have been ineligible activity. And then now you look at, say, Alpine, it's 12 million, it's essentially a percentage of And then you're gonna be given the 10 million, so it's a percentage of a percentage, which then ultimately leads people to have 50% or 60%.
Right, but by statute, we can only fund up to 85% of approved costs. So in column 5, we're saying that is your total approved costs. And of that, we can only, technically are only supposed to be funding up to 85% of that, not 100%.
We don't fund 100% of total costs.
So ultimately, it comes back down to the 1.083 and the 0.64, because that's causing the percentage of their actual approved costs.
Well, so the 2.9 million miles that's right there for Alpine, right?
Yes.
That is not the number of miles they submitted on their A1. Their A1 or am I saying this right? We take out activity miles, so this is reflective of activity miles being removed. So if you just straight up look at total costs for everything and total miles for everything, we have to get to eligible somehow. That's what the statute tells us to do. And so that's what this final allocation sheet does, is it brings in all of those adjusted numbers across. And that $12.4 million is a calculation, right? It's the adjusted miles, the adjusted minutes, time the averages, you're right. And essentially, if we were funding everybody at 85%, we would fund 85% of the 12.4, right? And that's, I think, how we calculated how much the legislature would need to provide to get everybody to 85%. Is we basically said, okay, column 5 is what the total eligible costs were for this year. And keep in mind, this is a year, for the 18th allocation, we're using your 16 school year. So kind of back to the question about how efficient can people be.
Right.
This is on a 2-year lag because it takes so long for us to gather the data, audit it, and use it. Even if your LEA is being efficient, or even if you're inefficient for a year, it doesn't catch up with you for 2 years. And so I would argue that most LEAs look at this when it comes out to see what it is they're getting paid, and that's really the amount of time they spend looking at it. They're not really looking at it going, oh yeah, we did better than Paiute this year, woohoo. Like, I don't really think people are doing that because the data is on such a lag. It's not, I don't think that, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think LEAs are using what you see here in the average cost to make decisions on a daily basis.
No, we're just using that to subsidize what's already going in the hole.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, and I really appreciate the information. So you sent this out, and I'm looking at, okay, how's my overhead? What's my shop, my office, my training salaries compared to my driver's salaries? We talk about how much goes to the classroom. Well, how much am I spending on drivers who are actually hauling kids compared to office? And the average in the state from your is 67% of the salaries are going to bus drivers, and I looked at ours and 73%. So I'm thinking, okay.
You're feeling pretty good.
I think there's other ways that this data can be used. We haven't usually, maybe the business administrators, the transportation folks haven't seen this.
So back to the in lieu. So I guess what you're saying is you don't pay off of a form anymore.
So we're basically going for the costs that are reported as in lieu on your APR.
Okay, and so you're paying that fee once per year, or you're paying it monthly?
Once a year.
Once a year. So when we're processing that for a parent, what rate are we paying that now?
The district rate.
So there's a cap in the rule, right?
Right.
You put like the IRS cap in the rule, but your LEA can use whatever rate you would.
Rate we can get away with.
Whatever you, up to that cap.
But by the time you take that amount of money, which is a finite amount, and it's different per district, by the time you take that, you take our total allowable, you add the 2, and then you turn around and prorate it, okay? Then if we've paid that at the full rate, we're not getting reimbursed for the in lieu. We're only getting reimbursed at the prorated amount. So in essence, we're all getting a different return off of the in lieu money.
So if we were to pay everyone's in lieu first, we would then have to prorate what was left against everyone else's 85%. There's still only one pot of money.
That's right, but the in lieu money is now all of a sudden worth 100%, whereas the bus route is all over the place because it's affected by how much in lieu expense we have.
That's fair. And if there were a separate appropriation for in lieu, I think it would be treated differently, but where it's one pot of money. Your in lieu isn't being, it's not being reimbursed at the average rate. You're right. That's why we bring it in the formula. Will you go back there? That's why we bring it into the formula at the end.
Yeah.
And bring it in as 100% instead of having like a statewide average, an in lieu average or something. We bring it in at 100%. So for Alpine only had $20,000 of in lieu. And so if you went back and did the calculation, their total to from would be what, 12,438,000, and then the $20,000 that's in lieu goes on top of that.
But I know in a rural district, it's kind of like, somebody advertising free tickets to the movie. If you got a town that knows that there's in lieu money, that spreads like wildfire, and everybody in that town takes advantage of it, and you might have a bigger population in another town that don't take a dime of it because they haven't caught on to it yet. But that's costing us the full amount, not the fractional amount that your prorate gives us back.
Right. Well, your bus driver salaries, it's not like you reduce the amount you pay your drivers based on what you get reimbursed. Right? I think you're kind of helping make my point is I don't think LEAs are using this average to plan your total costs. You're planning your services and your costs based on what your constituents or your parents expect, right? Or what you think your average or if you know that you have a town where they're all going to take advantage of in lieu, I think that you're probably budgeting for that.
Is in lieu contract carrier?
No, it's your.
In lieu is usually paying parents.
They live 3 miles away from school, and so they pay you.
Yeah, that's what we call a contract carrier.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
So you know right now in your district which towns or cities are going to take advantage of that. And I would guess that you probably budget for those costs because you know they're going to happen. Is that fair? I mean, I
don't know that would be a fair statement or not. I think it's a big question mark every year.
What's the total in the amount? Total bottom four.
1.33.
So what are the standard, what qualifies you for using in lieu as opposed to?
A lot of kindergarten transportation, because you don't have bus routes running during kindergarten times. Another would be is somebody that lives 5 miles from the bus stop.
I get that, but what are the stop conditions we have now in lieu, since that gets factored in the formula? So is there like a standard that you have to, that it's cheaper than the average cost to give them a?
Well, the reimbursement amount says we have to have, so many special ed kids or so many regular kids before we can create a spur or a bus route.
Yep.
And so if we can't create a bus route or can't justify firing up a bus, we have no choice but to pay the in lieu.
That's how you get those kids to the bus routes, your designated bus routes, is by paying in lieu after the mile and a half or 2 miles, where you want to pay through 6 and
So the
7.
student still has to be eligible for transportation. Really the
That's
problem we're trying to
correct.
solve is on the district side, it's not worth firing up a bus to go pick up 2 kids. It's much easier to pay the parent mileage to take them to a route that's already established.
It's not
where you
worth
have
firing
room.
up a bus to go get 10 kindergarten kids because it's a special route. You're not getting a whole bus full, you're just getting kindergarten. So that route doesn't even exist.
In some circumstances, I think in rural areas, they pay parents to transport students like off a mountain or something down to a state road where there's a bus stop.
Yep.
Instead of taking a bus all the way up into a place maybe it can't go or something. Is that right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. The difficulty that we've had is sometimes because we're paying on the bus, not the student, you can have a student who lives 1.7 miles from the school, but the efficient way to route the bus is the bus stop would be 1.4 miles and the student would come down to it. But the way it's audited now, we have to run that bus out to get that student, because if we have that stop under there, it doesn't matter that the student's eligible, the bus stop's not eligible.
Because it's a courtesy stop. Yeah, that's a bad definition. Maybe at some point that's something we need to talk about that. Well, in our district, we have some.
For trying to be efficient.
Yeah, we have some, several bus stops where the most efficient place for the bus stop would
Not be where it is.
inside the walk boundary. And all of the kids that are eligible have to walk to that because there's not a place to take a bus up there and turn around and come back. but we get penalized for that, for trying to be efficient.
Right. And sometimes we end up doing things that aren't quite as safe because it's a narrow road and there's some big, gosh, we gotta go in to get them. You've got, you know, the parents aren't gonna agree to the fee in lieu of, and so then you're taking it, we say, gosh, it'd just be a lot safer to.
Well, and I think all of those issues are definitely things that should be evaluated. And that, I think that leads into our conversation of is there an accurate or reasonable definition for how we're measuring things? You're right, every LEA does things a little bit different. And I think that we've found that as we've started looking into things and had conversations with various LEAs on how they measure or track or manage or make decisions. I know I got a phone call about whether mom puts all 4 of her kids into the car. Do we pay her in lieu for every kid, or one in lieu for the trip?
Just the vehicle.
Right, and different districts do different things. That district in question actually paid for every kid.
Oh, wow.
Because the students themselves were eligible. And
That's when you get those situations like you were talking about.
yeah, so I think
The whole town's
that,
gonna go for that.
yeah, woo. So I think that there are, I mean, I've heard of an in lieu payment for a student with special needs.
That's right.
Because it was safer to have the student come to school in their specialized van than it was to put them in the car. And I think that, I think one of the hard things for us at the state is we could make policies about everything, but then we would have policies about everything. And to some degree, we want to leave some latitude to LEAs to make decisions, right? The local school boards and local LEAs have discretion to make judgment calls. So we've been having a lot of conversations about guardrails, right? What guardrails do we think people should stay in? Between those guardrails, whatever you want, right? And how do we come up with those for transportation? This one, I think, honestly, I think transportation and NES are the 2 most challenging things I've ever dealt with. Is there's just so many variables to take into consideration, and no matter what decision you make, somebody gets harmed. And that, I think that's the hardest part of a lot of these work groups, is trying to figure out how far do those guardrails go? Are they real narrow? Are they real wide? Are there a couple tiers?
I told Superintendent Horton that sometime I'd like him to assign me to child nutrition. Everybody gets to eat.
Fair.
Another use of the fee in lieu is often rural districts don't have enough time between their bus routes to do the full length of the route. So you may pay a parent to bring their student down to stop number 2, and shorten that route up. And we also try to eliminate, several districts try to eliminate one-on-one with a student for an excessive amount of time. If you have 20 minutes, doesn't matter what gender, bus driver or student, 20 minutes. Districts are trying to watch out for the drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Bring that student down to the next stop where we drop off 5 students.
Yeah, we have a lot of those situations. We do a lot of the in lieu. That's as far as just about $44,000.
Mm-hmm. And I know that when we studied it, we found that some districts were paying like 15 cents for in lieu per mile, and some districts were paying 60. And so I think what we put into the rule is no more than the IRS cap. Isn't that what we said? Mm-hmm. And basically left it to the districts to make a decision. But that was an issue that was actually brought up to the legislature, is why isn't every district doing the same thing?
Well, it's essentially, I'll go back right now and just say, all right, you have this stop, this stop, this stop, pay every single parent out there 55 cents a mile.
Mm-hmm.
To get them all in here, you have one stop, bring them in.
Mm-hmm.
Then it takes away from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That's really what I'm thinking about doing from a business standpoint. But it's just, I think the way your formulas have worked, and I'm gonna go back to, I don't know,
All those you're paying 100% cost.
yeah, exactly.
So they have the bike share program. We're gonna go back and we're gonna.
That's right.
The school bus share program and buy a bunch of Suburbans.
I don't know, to me, I think that if you look at that, the .183 and the .643, when you look at, say, Alpine or Jordan, and you take out the unallowable costs, and I get the number, and it doesn't even come close to the 12 million that they have, essentially it's taking a percentage of a percentage. And I think if that number is projected to the the state legislators to say, say, no, we do have a fixed pot of money right now. The goal should be not to try to come up with, in my opinion, to just say we're dealing with the money we've got right now. The goal should be how do we get new funding, because right now you have $14.6 million from Alpine, but then we're telling Alpine we're only going to consider 12 million, even though we know you had 14 million. So let's look at the 14 million of actual costs, figure out the 80% of that, and submit that to the legislature saying fund this. This is your true 80% across the state.
So from your perspective, we wouldn't use miles and minutes at all for anything?
I think that, I'm not saying, I think that there needs to be some consideration of efficiency, but if you look at the efficiency metrics we have right now, essentially no district is I mean, well, I should say there's two districts that have actually above the 80% funding rate.
So how would you back out activities and field trips from just total costs?
So if you want it back, use a different function.
So every LEA would have to track field trip mile or field trip costs.
You'll have a specific to from.
We already do.
Have to turn it in to balance out the bus.
Yeah. I track all my activities completely separate from my to and from.
So are you tracking actual costs for activities or what you bill?
Our activity drivers go to a separate budget. When I pay those activity drivers a wage.
Are we submitting that in July?
Yeah,
What about costs for the bus though?
So we have actual,
So
and
that's just your-
we could easily break that out too, because I actually purchase activity buses that are essentially, those are my buses that are used specifically for activities. And if we have to pull them into.
What about LEAs who don't have activity buses? Who use their to-from buses for activities?
Then essentially you could use a cost metric on that to where, like an IRS rate, to say, okay, if you're gonna use your to-from bus for an activity, apply a rate to it to say, we'll allow you to use this much of it for.
And in the trenches.
We do track that.
Everybody who has
We
activity
track both
buses.
separate.
They have
we
them
don't
all
have
on regular
activity
routes
buses.
because you
Use them
get
for
the
both.
pre-trip
But
minutes.
they're tracked separately.
Yeah.
The state, his firms make you already account for every single mile on every single vehicle.
And every
And
minute.
every single route is already pre-established, so you've got that finite amount, you subtract it to, and the rest has gotta be, mechanic miles, dead
Training.
miles,
Training.
or else. activity
Well, so
miles.
that's why I asked the question, is the way the formula is calculated now, it's approached, a calculation, you're applying an average cost from the APR, AFR to the miles and minutes that are attributed eligible. If you went your route, we would be going and looking at total costs and backing out ineligible costs. So we'd still have to gather data.
I think one thing that we're maybe not looking at right now is when we put together our A1 report, we're taking an estimate from a snapshot one time a year. And so Alpine may have added 5 or 6 routes because they're a big district and they're growing. That really skews that data. The other part to that is when you set up your A1, you're trying to get as good of a guess as you can of what you're going to be based on where you are right then. And so your miles and minutes, we're looking at data trying to see if you're above 5% what you're actually doing at the end of the year, and then if you are, the miles minutes, that funding gets capped, and if you underestimate, then it's your loss. And I've only seen a few. I've only looked over a few kind of in depth, but we're looking at 10% variance, or if some districts above 10% and then get cut down to 0, and that's going to be a big difference when we look at this report, is because they could have lost, or they would have an anticipated amount and they would get funded at the actual amount. And so if they lose 5% right off the bat, and if they underestimate, that's what they get versus what they actually did. So we're 10% inaccurate, and based on that snapshot. Yeah.
Just bump it up 10%.
So request high, but not too high. It's a challenge. I mean, that's.
So you're saying it's a guessing game?
Yeah, it's a guessing game. you know, there might be good explanations why you're low because you added routes. You may have mid-year had to consolidate routes, or change of schools mid-year. I mean, there's things all the time that are going to affect our data, and it's not live.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
Can we talk through the base?
The base allocation, everyone gets 30 grand.
'Cause that's what we know, is that there's a base allocation and everyone gets 30 grand.
And is that where you're looking at making your adjustments so the cap doesn't go above 85?
Well, before I do the base, everybody's at 80.83, so it's when I throw the
Right.
base in there in the formula that it's just skews everybody.
So you're looking at making the adjustments in the base, is that what your idea is?
It's a discussion.
Well, I think you mentioned earlier that it was originally designed for the activity trips, and so maybe that needs to be funded into a different category than in, you know, that might be
Not-
another.
not the
No,
base.
not the
it's
base.
not
Not the base.
That's the guarantee.
That's the guarantee.
Guarantee, you're right,
How much
okay.
does 30,000 skew
That's
the?
the guarantee.
So I'm going to show the percentages.
Yeah. Can't be that, I mean, it's well,
So take, for instance,
Intake is gonna be your big one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the base in Tintic means we're paying them 205% of the total amount that we calculated that was eligible.
So did you prepare something that if you use the base to bring that down, what that would put everybody's base at?
205% of nothing, though, is still nothing.
Yeah, I mean, you take their base away, it does nothing for everybody else.
Well, and our understanding of the base was that regardless of how many routes or buses or students that you have, you still have to have someone run the transportation function.
Correct.
So how it was explained to me is that the base was intended to ensure that at least a part-time person could be there to help run transportation.
Maybe
I don't think
help the
30,000 gets you a
rural
part-time person these days.
Maybe the reimbursement needs to be done off the other percentage before the base is in there.
But we still only have
Like
one.
Rick just said, who cares?
I think that the hard part for us is we still only have one pot of money. So if we pay everybody a base, well, and that's one of our core questions
What's
is,
the base
do we
total?
count the base towards the 85%? Because
Sure,
if we
why not?
don't,
Because most of us don't believe it's 85%.
no, it's true.
Well, the sad thing about it is if the legislature sees that everybody's funded at 85%, then they stop increasing the funding because they've met their expectation. But the districts are far below that, at least that's how we see it, and from our perspective,
So
they
we
haven't
will back
achieved
up.
the 85% or even come as close
So
as
to
it's
a-
reported to them that we are, and so it's not as urgent an issue for them. They think they've done their job, and
Is
So
it,
at the risk of jumping ahead to 3A, could we read the law that says 85%?
I'm just gonna ask this, that.
No. You
Does
have
it
it?
say in the law too, the percentages, the average of these percentages?
Do you have it? Oh, it's right here.
up to, no?
So is this, John, are you talking about if a local school board, no, this is the
No,
guarantee.
hold on.
Hang on. You don't want to read that one.
Because I think everybody's looking at it as a max.
Is this the same thing twice?
No, it's not.
Yeah,
a
it's not a
max.
max. It's not a max. We
it's a-
agree. We concur.
What, does it say anything about?
It says the legislature
The-
may appropriate up to.
No, it doesn't say up to. It says 85%.
The
think that's
legislature
a
shall
target.
Appropriate.
appropriate, I thought it said
Yeah.
at least.
Subject to budgetary.
We always,
Subject to
we all
budgetary,
remember
that's
what,
correct.
we all remember the shall and maybe and
So
up
that
to.
kind of pencils out everything before that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It does, but the whole intent
You put that in
was
there, didn't you,
that
Mel?
it's a floor, not a ceiling.
Subject to budget constraints. So, and it doesn't say anything about the average cost per mile or minute, so that, to me, as I'm reading it, it looks,
Well,
Yeah, there-
statute doesn't prescribe the formulas that we use anywhere with the exception of maybe WPUs.
So the
right?
85 could be counted as column 7. It could be defined that way.
So we've
The-
talked through the base a lot in lots of different formats. We've talked about count it, don't count it. If we don't count it, then we would have to pull, we think we should pull $30,000 out of eligible costs, right? Because in theory, if it's the funding for a transportation director, those expenditures are in your APR as eligible costs, right? We've talked about coming up with a base that is
Prorated.
higher for smaller LEAs with smaller numbers of students that then declines as you get bigger, right? I would argue that $30,000 for Alpine, they don't even notice it. But $30,000 for Tintic could probably shut their transportation department down. Fair?
True statement.
So how do we not penalize those? I mean, if you look at what we're paying Tintic, we're paying them what, like $49,000 with the base? So they may not have a lot of students or travel a lot of miles, but that's not very much money to transport students.
But it's 200% of costs.
Of eligible
What are they
costs.
doing with the rest of the money?
They're buying their athletic bus to go to all the competitions. Because that's their only source of revenue. It's the truth.
Well, that to me would be is that if you're gonna put a cap on it, you put a cap on 100% of costs.
Eligible costs?
100% of actual costs. Because I guess the difference between eligible costs for them and non-eligible is a matter of like $5,000. And
No,
the
it's
other
more than that,
districts
isn't
are
it?
probably never gonna get there.
I think it's more than that. So Tintic's total costs are $123,000.
So, okay, so that's eligible costs, so then.
So eligible was what, 10 grand or something?
19.
Yeah.
So is the remainder of their cost for,
Unless I can be Cody's assistant. I can be Cody's
Only
assistant.
10% of Tintic's
You need
miles
a-
are to and from your
Yeah. The rest of them are activity miles or ineligible miles.
Yeah.
So there,
They have a ton of
if
ineligible.
I remember, there's a ton of ineligible routes, a ton.
I guess the question.
For
would be
Tintic?
is-
so why should they be funded?
They're not. That's the point, is we
Well, I
throw
would
those
argue
miles
that they
out.
are the 200%.
Well, because of the base.
You can't take their base away though, they've gotta be able to run buses.
And,
I mean,
Yeah.
unless you wanna go tell them. you don't
Historically,
serve
with
14
anything
people
with the
on those
base,
days.
that's
you're right, the large districts don't notice it per se, but by the same token, we've almost got agreement between large and small districts. It's like, if there's a base,
Leave it.
it's
Leave it.
fine, just leave it.
Yeah.
We understand that, we're only getting 30,000 on the base, and that to Tintic, that 30,000 is colossal to them. So large districts have never argued against what the base does to a really small district like Tintic. But we also don't wanna come and grab 30,000 and throw it on the table, cause we're going in the hole too, you know, so.
We had also talked about, for an LEA who's over the 85, maybe we just pay them the base.
I don't know why, I keep coming back to, I don't know why we're using the base to worry about
I think the base,
column
the base
10.
is small.
It's such an inconsequential amount, which is odd to say for a $1.2 million budget, but in short, it's really skewing you from the 80.83 to up to a 205.35. And that skewing doesn't matter to most of us. To all the rest of us that had only moved the dial 1%, we don't care that it moved the dial 140% for Cody.
Unless it
Doesn't
moves
matter.
it from the legislature, seeing
Sure.
that so then we're all affected.
No question, I don't dispute that at
So I
all.
don't know how we
Yeah.
could address that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all.
And initial things I've heard is that no one should be paid more than 100% of their eligible costs, but I think that only holds until they see which districts are over 100% of their eligible costs, and then that goes out the window.
Yes.
So,
Because it's Tintic and Rich and.
Yes.
and so you have to have some rational reason So either you exclude the base from the definition of
85%.
of the 85%, which I think would be a rational way to do it.
You still
Or
fund
do
it,
a-
but you exclude
yeah,
it from the.
from the calculation of 85%.
Yeah.
Or you do some threshold of student population perhaps, that if you have more or less than a certain threshold population, then you can go over the 100%.
Sure.
Because you have to have something that you
Yeah,
could write
yeah,
into
yeah,
a
yeah,
law
I agree.
that could.
To hold everyone consistent.
So Natalie, do
Can
you
you
see a change on the NES funding based on all this 205%?
This is all separate.
You're not.
Look,
Can
we
we
pull
for
up
the
the
NES
law.
working group?
No, but I have to protect
That's
the
in-
NES. I have to protect the NES.
That's in a month after a month.
We pull,
I think what
pull
he's
up the
saying
law.
is he just doesn't want this to affect NES, because that would be a killer.
Right now, they're not related at all. So transportation is a factor for being eligible for NES.
Yes.
But we don't calculate any of the
We don't want
NES
the
formula on anything to do with
$30,000 to go on
transportation.
Shall be distributed according to section 53 F2 43. Will you click on that? I want to see what that
This one?
says. The 53 F2 403. It's under 3A.
Allowable
So it is the
miles.
mile a minute piece in here.
Mhm. Yeah, that's in statute.
That's why the formula is written.
And
the
this
way
is
that
the
it
base right here. That's base, miles, minutes.
And
So
it
maybe-
says we have to use prior year eligible transportation costs.
But does it say anything about the average cost, or the average rate that we're using, the average cost per mile a minute?
Oh, I think I see what you're saying.
No.
Because if it doesn't say anything
No,
about the average
no.
cost per mile a minute, why are we using it? Because ultimately, that average cost per mile a minute is harming everybody.
Well, I think
But without it, it would harm everybody too.
Well, here's the thing though, is, but what I'm saying is if you don't use the average and you just show this is the cost to the state legislators, and you say this is where the funding is at, they're gonna look at it and go, holy crap, we're not even close to the 85%.
So you'd still be prorated. You realize, right, that even if we just used your costs, we'd come up with what your eligible costs are.
Yep.
We'd come up with everybody's eligible costs and we'd still prorate. And effectively what that would do is then redistribute amongst everybody.
But
So is 53,402 talking about the that it will reimburse, the state will reimburse, is that state USBE or is that state the allocation from?
But what I'm saying is that right now, my eligible costs per se are 3.6 million. But once you put those metrics to it, what actually shows up is 2.4. So it's $1 million shaving off the top that the state legislators
back
don't
to
even
the
get
law.
to see about.
So help me understand how you would implement 4B.
4B,
Approved route funding shall be determined on the basis of the most efficient and economic routes. Our understanding from talking to those who calculated this formula or put this formula together, and we've tried to find documentation, it's kind of exactly like NES. We've tried to find documentation as to how we got here, and no one really has it. Our understanding is that there was work groups just like this who came up with the average cost to implement
To
the
satisfy that.
how do we have internal controls to ensure the LEAs are being efficient and economic in their routes. Part of that is by setting standards and auditing the routes that we're paying for, and the other part is trying to set some minimums or some guardrails to keep everybody from going crazy.
but here's the thing, is it's so subjective to what they're doing, because like, well, Jordan may have a massive pool of people to hire from, because they have the population and they can hire somebody as a 29.5-hour bus driver, and, right? I am competing with the oil field where they are advertising on the radio right now, come out to the oil field, we'll start you with 75 grand with your CDL.
I would argue that Kyle probably has the same issues getting drivers in San Juan.
It's across the entire state, we're
And,
not special.
and Tintic, I think Tintic has the issue. I mean, isn't their superintendent driving their bus? Or doesn't Cody drive their bus? Or Jeremy, doesn't Jeremy drive the bus in Tintic? Didn't he at one point?
in time, I thought he did.
I think
He's
they're.
probably driving an ineligible route.
That's right.
Well, sorry.
This notion question that the most efficient economic routes. So essentially, the average cost per mile or minute does not necessarily determine the most economic route. We've already seen that. We've had examples of it. And if we see that our buses are essentially 80% or the 75% that we've targeted, and we've got it, then I guess the question is by just trying to say we're using the state average to determine that, when they can pack their buses in 2 stops and it takes me an hour and 20 minutes, it skews things quite a bit for a lot of people. And your own formula even shows that, because when you look at it, there's only 2 districts in the entire state that are above 80%.
I think you ought to send that to them so they can look it over.
I know that we, when we started doing we did an intent language report a couple years ago where we tried to determine who the most efficient district was and how they got there. Kind of like a best practices. We spent a lot of time talking to Jordan about a lot of the efficiencies. You guys are all on natural gas, right? Is that right?
Not all.
A portion, right? A good chunk. That didn't come without substantial capital costs, right? And the way that Jordan was able to get into natural gas worked out well for them, and your board was supportive of it. But there are other LEAs who aren't supportive of it, or they're, because of their geography, natural gas doesn't work for them. Isn't you into one of those areas?
So we had actually bought a bunch of natural gas buses, and we had to throw them away pretty much. We sold them to Washington because it's
too cold.
It's too cold, so we had to go to propane. And propane's working great, and for the fuel piece, it's been saving us a bunch. It still doesn't change the fact.
But that's one element, right?
The bulk of our transportation is.
Your personnel costs are probably the highest percentage of your costs in total, right?
Is.
Because of the economy?
Because we can't get drivers. We can't hire drivers.
How old is this formula, like the sheet, the Excel sheet, as it's constituted now?
At least 2012, 13, somewhere around in there.
Have you talked to Pat O'Hara? He was the transportation specialist when this Pat O'Hara.
I know that
miles and minutes, this was all developed, he was the transportation
he was
specialist at that time.
He was pre-legislative audit, so I don't know what changes were made to the formula after that audit. But listening to this conversation, I'm not thinking many were made.
Yeah, doesn't sound good.
But, kind of this conversation, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but I think, from what I can tell right now, the only thing that's forcing some form of efficiency is that average. So I think you have to figure out some other way to do that, because I see that tied to the 85%. If you lose this, you lose that. Because there's no way they're going to go through and just pay 85% of whatever you report your costs are. You have to have that efficiency there so they know that you're getting some type of benefit from that. Does that make sense? So if you get rid of that part, I would say you lose 85% as well.
Some of our most efficient routes run 2 hours. I'd like to invite the legislators for a field trip down to San Juan.
Well, the other thing, Dan, is refresh my memory, is, at the time of the legislative audit, I just remember how devastating was but the 85% was put in. Was it just before that or just after that?
The 85 was put in at the same time as depreciation was taken out.
Yeah. And
so it was, I think that was seen as an easy give, especially with the subject to future budget constraints, to get both. And so it was definitely a
because I remember
political
us
thing.
being told, well, we lost in depreciation, but look, we got the 85%.
But depending on how you calculate that, and that's really what led up to the problem this session, is you have the BAs and the Superintendent's Association saying that they needed $5 million over 4 years, which is a fairly big ask to get up to 85%. Then you go through and you look at this formula, and that is the way to look at it, and we're close to being there based on this formula. Then what's happening? I mean, you got $4 million anyway, but
and what was the $4 million? Was that for growth, or was that
So that was on top of growth.
That was on top of growth.
That was on top of.
Yeah, so there was probably a total of $7-8 million
$7.6
put into the program this year.
And it wasn't just growth and cost of living. It was.
No, it was an extra.
So it's
$4 million
additional legislative
boost.
ask.
Thank you very much.
And so, yeah, so I don't think it's a dead stop on the question, but it kind of led to what we're going through and why they want to have this kind of set that everyone's on board of how we're calculating this 85%, so everyone knows the target. If that in fact stays the target.
And is the extra 4 million what got us to the 79 million, or is that?
So this is 18's formula,
Okay.
not 19's.
Okay.
So yeah, 19 would have that $7 million. Which then causes that those percentages to increase, I would presume.
Right. Yep. And those that are getting over
So
85
based on
went
that,
up, and everybody else
they're-
went up a little
they're
higher
thinking,
too.
oh, we're there.
Yeah.
If you look at this formula, we don't have a problem, we're funding 85%. But that's not what they're hearing from their districts. And so what we have to find is how do you bring
Come to an
those two
agreement
together?
between everybody.
Well, and I think one of the cores is when you just look at total costs and you do your calculation on total costs, that includes things that are not eligible under this funding source.
So do we need
And
to-
I think that's hurdle one, is that everybody has to understand that, yes, it does cost more than what eligible is being represented as to run transportation, but there are some things that are not supposed to be paid for this, out of this by definition in the statute.
And do you feel like the business administrators throughout the state are reporting similarly enough that it's?
I don't know if we,
Do you?
I don't know if I have enough data to make that.
To me, the big difference, sorry if I'm.
No, go ahead, Joe.
To me, the big difference in the two calculations is they're doing it the way it's been set up to be done, and then other people are looking at today's funding, today's costs. There's a 2-year lag.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think that there are probably a lot of eligible transportation costs that are not being booked into transportation. I think that I don't think people are overstating costs. I think people are understating costs. And a lot of that is because we just don't have the manpower to go through and do the cost allocations that you're talking about. And like I said, when I went through and just looked at insurance, there is no way the LEAs are not incurring costs for insurance on transportation. That's got to be a huge part of your insurance costs. But whether your LEA makes the decision to record that to transportation or not, so it can be counted for transportation, I'm seeing that most people aren't. If you look at liability insurance, which I'm sure you're paying property and liability, and maybe everyone's just lumping it into property, I don't know. But there's not many LEAs who are actually recording insurance costs, and if you don't put it there, I can't give you credit for it. I think we're more on the side of LEAs aren't reporting everything they could to be eligible.
So could you go back through that and maybe flag a different color for everything that's included in the formula?
Essentially all.
Everything in color is included in the
Everything green and
formula.
orange at the top
So
are-
just the ones without
Okay.
are excluded from it.
So what you guys missed
In lieu.
before you got here
Blues
is,
in lieu.
as we went through the items
Go
that are
across that.
excluded, right? We didn't go through all of them. I know we want to talk about that. One of the things, the changes we made in the chart of accounts this year was to get rid of all those other categories. And we put in like an aids category, because everyone represented that other actually represents bus aids, and those should be eligible, right? So we tried to get rid of all those dumping ground categories across the board in our chart of accounts so that we had a better understanding what costs were. And I think we'll see a little bit of a shuffle of some of those other things being categorized into what they actually are this year. But there are some things like,
I'll suggest something to you, because of the disconnect between what was presented in this calculation.
Because the equipment's not part of it.
At the next you guys will see more going over this calculation, which made a lot of people go.
well, that's why we made the video.
The insurance thing, I'm gonna go home back right now. I'm gonna do a journal entry this year and move our insurance over.
Well,
I mean,
that's a legitimate
granted,
cost.
That's $100 grand, but, and I think that's, here's the thing though, is that if we're already not getting 80% of understated costs, putting more costs in there is just gonna make that percent go low.
However, in order to justify to the legislature the cost of to from, it has to be accurately represented.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's, I think, one of the other questions that we get is, well, is this right? And yes, it's what I have, yes.
Well, another thing, and I may be wrong on this, another thing that you may be getting out of business administrators and superintendents is the percent that they're accustomed to seeing is on a steady decline. You know, so whatever calculation or methodology they're using in their own district, as they talk to their own legislator, they're going, well, yeah, it used to be that we got 80% of the cost and now we get 60% of the cost. So when you talk about what could possibly be churning among superintendents and business administrators, that may well be an element of it.
Well, and to go along with that, I mean, just look at what gas prices are doing this month, right? We don't make an adjustment for, this formula doesn't get a CPI adjustment.
Correct.
It gets an adjustment for growth of students, but it doesn't really get a CPI adjustment. And in order to do something like that, we'd have to have actual costs included. Does that make sense?
I would argue it does, because it gets WPU.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not directly tied to a CPI.
Right.
But
It's not as directly related. I think this is the one formula that is most influenced by purchasing power. Like, teacher salaries, I know, are different. It's a different conversation, and those also go up every year. But I believe that trying to recruit drivers, right? I know one of the other initiatives that Ron has a lot of projects that he's working on. Doesn't have anything to do with the formula, but trying to figure out how to get drivers trained more quickly so that they can be productive employees and not spend so much time in training is really going to enable you to recruit people faster. Doesn't have anything to do with the formula, but there are some environmental factors and some administrative factors that also put up barriers to recruit staff. And so we're trying to work through those as well, not formula related, but that's not going to change the cost or the salaries that you have to pay people. I think that the change, I've heard a lot of comments from LEAs about when the change in federal insurance laws kicked in and you had to start paying employee benefits.
Correct.
And that really limited the pool of people that we can recruit for bus drivers if the district isn't willing to pay benefits. And so some of those environmental factors or those outside factors that we can't control also impacted some of those, and then are driving your costs up as well.
Well, and that's what I'm getting to, Natalie. Very well said, because I don't hear chatter among superintendents and business administrators saying, we got to overhaul the formula. You know, so I'm not arguing. I mean, this is a valuable activity, and we could well come up with some critical things that are very important for making a position statement with the legislature. But generally speaking, it's not, I feel like I've been treated inequitably, or, you know, somebody's getting, District A is getting more than District B based on the formula. I think it's generally the feeling that the amount of money that's having to come out of general fund coffers to support transportation deficits is getting greater and greater. I mean, that's the very simple math that I think business administrators and superintendents are doing. So, so as a starting point, I think we've got to be doing whatever we can do to say we've got to increase the revenue coming to districts in relation to transportation. And if a formula argument is the best way to do it, then that's great. I was glad to hear, you know, Ben brought it up, the increased money that's coming out of this session. Because really the starting point would be, well, if we were at 80.83, the very first thing we ought to be saying is, well, why aren't we at 85?
And then
Based on all the current calculations and formulas, and for all their flaws and weaknesses and gaps, if we're at 80.83, we ought to be at 85, just to start with.
And we just have to realize, because of the 2-year lag, when we compare it, it will never be 85.
Correct.
So one of the things, I mean, is I've gone and run
Do you want to project, Derek?
You can put your screen up.
Well, I mean, I can if we want to. One of the things that, as I've ran this, is there's only 10 districts. If you go back to the first average cost per mile a minute.
Oh, you have a map.
The first tab one. There are only 10 districts in the state, if you go all over, that are below the average. those are the only 9 of those 10 districts are at 70% or above. So you literally have to be below the state average to even be at 70% of the funding.
Will you talk us through one? Show me one of the districts you're
Yes,
talking
yeah,
about.
yeah. So, take, well, I'll come up here and show you who's in.
You can get on. If you don't have a Mac, you can get on. We just.
I don't
we
have
just,
a Mac, is the
Oh.
projection thing.
Oh no, you just get on the
You stay,
Wi-Fi.
Yeah, stay there then. You're here. I'm gonna stop.
Okay.
If you just open up a web page.
Open up a web page.
And put in that.
Man, that's snazzy.
Just put 10.10.70.57 in the browser.
Okay.
So while he's doing that, can we bring up, so equipment, according to this, is a part of the calculation.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that Alpine, Herb?
The largest school district in the state, Alpine,
Mm-hmm.
is at
$27,000.
And you go down to Davis.
1.6 million.
I'm thinking
There's
that
gotta
that's
be a
school buses.
discrepancy in the way
I'm
that
thinking
they're.
Davis reported their school buses in the equipment, and that's part of the calculation. Should we all?
That's brilliant.
Leave it to Davis to find the list.
This surprises who? This surprises who? No, I'm not.
Well, I'm just thinking we should share.
Yeah, unless you're buying school buses, I don't know how you spend $1.6 million on equipment in a year.
That is something I will look into.
Well,
That
that's
is
a lot.
snazzy.
Yeah.
Conversions.
They did conversions, they did.
Holy cow, that is snazzy.
No, I was waiting for.
Really expensive.
Yeah, after.
All right.
We bought 2 lists this year, and that was 100,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
There you go.
yeah, so here's what I ended up doing, is I took the total transportation right here, that amount, and I went and I backed out, you can see these subtractions. I backed out anything that was over here, it was like school buses, the 511, okay?
Any of the ineligible.
Any of the ineligible, I
Okay.
went and backed those out, okay? So then what I've gone and done is I said, okay, pull in this 10.9 million from the funding on the final allocation.
Right.
Okay?
Including the base, or no.
This
that-
final allocation, right?
That doesn't include the base.
So.
Yeah, it does include.
No, it does include the base,
Final
yeah.
allocation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so then, what I wanted to do is I just did a simple determination of the percentage, okay? Of all the school districts,
So you realize that that still has costs associated with activities in it.
Field trips and activities.
okay, so field trips activities are still in.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Because that's your total cost, that's total transportation, that includes,
Well-
should include everything.
So, our district, we completely do it completely separate, so we do it in 5316 instead of 5315.
Oh.
And that's not
So-
coming through on your APR.
So so on your line, Derek, it's truly just from transportation costs,
Yeah.
is what you're telling me?
Yes. So.
So
So-
here, you're hurting yourself, and
You're hurting
Davis is
yourself,
putting their buses
yeah.
in equipment.
Put your 5316 in there also, because they're already back.
We're making a list of people to audit. Thank you.
Yeah. Starting a list.
So, but if you look at this, there's only 10 districts that are above 70% that way. Then you look over here, the average cost per mile, and average cost per mile and average cost per minute of the districts that are below the average, there's 10 of them, and they have to meet it in both categories. They had to meet it in both categories
Small, probably, right?
for it to actually show up. Moving around too much.
Yeah.
For even trigger at 70 or 90%. So essentially, unless you are like better than average on both categories, you're
It's all
not
my
even gonna
rural.
come close
A lot of the rural.
to meeting the average.
Which, that makes sense though, because your rurals generally have they have a smaller number of students, but
Yeah.
generally travel more.
So that's what I mean.
Because you still have activity costs in here.
Okay, so think about Iron County, because Ironton's in yellow on the left, and there's no, if I'm reading across the line right, there's no yeses. So explain, and don't audit me because I brought it up. But you explain to me.
So,
I'm gonna keep my mouth shut.
Well, no,
That should be a yes right there.
So I'm a yes?
On this one, it's a yes. Because 4.5
because you're below the average.
is below the average
Mm-hmm.
on that one.
So are you saying is this a bad thing or a good thing?
So I did these on the opposite direction.
You're making money on it.
You're getting too much.
You're
money.
making
On my
money
way.
on.
I
Mhm.
make what, on my way.
But yeah, and I think a lot of the minutes depends on, that's a factor of how long your routes are, right? 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 Because you can also have a high minute route that's a short distance if you're in an urban area, right?
And it also
With
takes
stoplights and Bangater and crazy stuff.
minutes also takes into account your school bell schedules, because you're gonna have some dead minutes in between your two runs.
Because we have a unique situation where we're urban and rural.
Yeah.
What I found in this job is that everyone has unique situations. That's what I found. I know that when I visited Garfield, so I came and visited Garfield a couple years ago, and your transportation director showed me how in some of your more rural areas, the bus driver lives there. He picks up all of the students that have to come to school, kindergarten through 12th grade, right? And the district, I believe, was it Garfield or Grand? I think it was Grand.
Yeah.
We
I
have
think it's
several of
Grand.
those situations.
But
And you
they,
saw it, you went to San Juan.
yeah, we went to San Juan, but I think it was Grand, where they would pick up, the bus driver had the bus at his house. He would go and pick up all the students, K through 12, and the district had modified their bell schedule so that schools started within 10 minutes of each other, I think is what it was. So they drop off high school first? I don't remember. Anyway, they would drop the kids off. The driver actually worked at one of the schools, so they'd leave the bus at the school. And at the end of the day, the driver would get in the bus, pick up the kids in reverse order, and out they'd go. So they look efficient because they have one bus doing one route but picking up everybody. And so they had I think 5, doesn't Grand only have 7 routes or something? There's 1 or 2 in town and one goes this way, one goes this way. I mean, it was kind of like a starburst off of the district, right? But they only needed 7 buses to do what they needed to do because they picked up everybody, and the district adjusted their bell schedules to accommodate transportation. And some districts are totally willing to do that, and other districts, there's not a chance, right? There's absolutely 0 chance that your parents would go for having school start within 10 minutes of each other, right? Or not have an early out day.
Yeah,
or
but we
some of
don't
those
have
things.
that, but we still have 40 buses that are
Mhm.
kept with that same concept, kept at the driver's home. We don't.
Some
can't
LEAs
alter the,
allow, some LEAs allow that, others don't, right? And just, like I said, when we tried to find things that really were unique.
So what difference
we didn't
does
find
a loaded
anything.
or an empty mile make?
Doesn't make any difference.
No.
I don't think it does.
So why do we worry about that? Instead of the total mile for the route? Why do we?
It's a wrong question.
It's a good question.
I frankly don't really care how far your stops are away from each other, but Ron might care a lot more than I do. So I
think some of the calculations that we're looking for when you run the macro, we're trying to figure out how many some numbers. We're looking at speeds.
I used to ask Pat O'Hare, I said, well, are you gonna pay us perhaps as an incentive, you get a little less for empty miles than you do for loaded miles? And they said, no. You get the same cost per mile or same allocation per mile, and I'm just saying, well, why are we worried about it then?
Yeah, why do we report it?
Well, and I think that we need to have a different work group to talk about what's really required on the A1, because that's an issue we've been talking about for a while. Some of the things that you're asking about don't determine whether that route is eligible or not, that is the only thing that matters here, is whether your route was eligible or not. What you actually have to report and what we actually need is another question. And that's, again, we don't want to create a system with a bunch of stuff we don't need. I only want to gather the stuff that we actually care about, or that give us data we can use,
And keep
right?
everybody happy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and keep everybody happy.
Yeah.
I gave up on that a long time ago.
So now you bring up a couple
Yeah.
points. What Derek was saying tells me that years ago on the APR, I don't know if you were here or not, Natalie, Jamie, but years ago on the APR, there were two columns, one for to and from and one for your other costs. And every district was asked to split those out between the two with whatever functionality they and their auditors could agree to. So that was broken out, and it sounds like Uinta had done that.
We did that, because of our auditors who came in and said that.
Yeah, broke it out to 5316, 5315. And then later, the State Board of Education office here said, you know what, just collapse them back in. We're gonna do it based on miles. So if there are districts out there that have not collapsed that back in, then this is gonna be skewing.
So
a lot
is
of those
5316
results.
showing up in the general fund then, and not rolling into the transportation function?
I don't know.
It just have to be how we're rolling it up.
Are you reporting it to the 2700 function?
No, we're not.
So then,
because
yeah, it's not showing up in here.
I'll have to go back and double check, but I'd have to.
Well, and that actually makes a lot of sense,
'Cause
because
our-
I think in some of the conversations we heard from BAs, there were those that were saying, no, I'm tracking my to from separately. And we're like, where?
So
Where are you doing that separately?
They must have been out on break or something when it was announced, but let's collapse those back in.
Huh.
You do not report those separately any longer. I mean, it should. It is
Well, I
what
guess
it
the
is.
question would be why, if you guys are going back and ripping them back out, why not just go separate? Well, I mean,
Well, because a lot of districts don't. And so if we do report already the miles in a separate state report that says here's our to from and here's our other miles, the state has a method to divide those out themselves.
So you're getting reduced twice, not just
Yeah.
once.
Yeah. So I think this is another UASBO discussion. Tell everybody, okay, we can't be on break. We go. No, I'm not saying anything.
Or do we want to start tracking them separately again?
Yeah.
I mean, you could go either way. Do we want to start tracking them separately? Is there a value in that?
I think you're better with the state measure myself, but the second thought I wanted to throw out was there was some discussion about your property insurance, or sorry, not your property insurance, but your liability insurance. But NCES says liability insurance is coded to district administration.
it's true.
So if we can code it here, woo-hoo, I just lowered administration and I got paid more for it. But there's gonna be.
So will you also write down how that
There'll be a
impacts
little
indirect
bit of
costs?
heartburn for that.
It could also impact your indirect cost pool.
So are they getting audited?
It could also impact your indirect cost pool.
We do every year anyway.
That would impact that.
So liability insurance is an allowable cost for transportation, we can't count it in there instead of administration, like you're saying, John.
We're gonna
Well,
check.
I guess I'm wanting.
There's
direction.
secondary effects.
Yeah.
Because if we can put it here, and that's a state choice, I mean, I just.
Let's
we
go
don't
research that one.
necessarily
Yeah,
always
let me-
follow NCS, but if we want to go.
It's like the
differently,
pirate code.
Then we just tell everybody, look, allocate it based on whatever measure. And then a lot of districts would put some additional costs there as well. Because there is no doubt, transportation is a huge part of our liability
Right.
premiums.
Yeah, I just saw $2,000, there's no way we're gonna pay liability insurance.
Well, I know, when I first looked at this a couple years ago, there was a couple districts that didn't have fuel costs in their transportation function. And we called them and said, you sure about that? And I think it's just not something that we usually.
Electric, no, solar.
Solar buses.
Solar buses.
Okay, and can I ask a question on a formula?
Yes.
It's I think it's column AY. Jamie, I talked to you about this. I can't remember the number.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think
but
it's,
there it's up there.
The
oh,
one right there, benefits, I can,
yeah, benefits to supervisors.
If you go to column AY.
I've inserted some columns, so that's the one that's by
Yeah,
AY.
that's fine, because you inserted two. The one in questions was my AY, so now it's your BA.
Yeah.
But if you click on your AY column, and we look at the formula in there, it's a simple allocation. Then if you click on AZ, it's a simple allocation. But when you click on BA, all of a sudden we subtract out insurances.
Health and dental.
And so our health and dental piece is not being allocated.
Doesn't make any sense, does
I
it?
don't
No,
know
I don't know
why
why.
that one allocation allocates differently than the other two allocations.
Shouldn't.
And I think that's just an error.
Mm-hmm. I went back and checked the formulas after we talked, John, and they're all the same way.
Yeah, everybody's that way.
Mhm.
No, I meant like years.
Years.
Went back years.
Exactly.
So it's something that either was a mistake or was intentional. I don't know, but does anyone know of a reason why you would exclude that?
So what are you excluding, the insurance?
Benefits.
You're excluding health and dental
Dentals.
For supervisors?
for supervisors and secretaries.
Like it's
As an unallowable cost.
Yeah.
Well, that
And
doesn't make
yet
sense.
the wages for the supervisors
Doesn't make any
and
sense.
secretaries is allowable.
And retirement.
And
So can we all agree to fix that?
Please.
Okay.
Yay! See, we agreed on something.
Now you can get insurance. As of today.
Maybe I can take a sick day.
Now, don't go that far.
Wait till after
Yeah, for 19, can we
And
fix that?
Yeah, I'll fix that. So that's gonna change the allocation for
That'll
19.
change your allocations for 19, but we can fix
I'll
that.
fix it for 19.
Another thought is, and again, at risk of going to 3A, but the 85%, does it say anywhere that it has to be based on the 2-year-ago piece, or could it be on? In other words, could the allocation be 95% based on 2 years ago, knowing that 2 years later, it might be 85%?
But how would we, so keep in mind that when we have to figure out how much we need to fund a fiscal year, we need to know 18 months before the year begins. So October of this year, we'll have to figure out how much money we need. So I anticipate that the legislature would ask us, okay, you guys agreed on what 85% means. How much money do you need to get to 85%? And we'll have to estimate that using the A1 reports that we have and the total number of students and the total costs, right? So 18 months in advance, I have to estimate what we need for that upcoming year.
So could we, though, based on history, we would have the APR data, we could go back and say,
I don't have APR data in October for the current year.
I thought the APR was due in October 1st.
Yes, but then it has to be reconciled with your
Financial statements, which we don't do until November
30th, so I
If we-
technically
if
don't
we
have
went
until December.
Historically, though, I guess what I'm saying is that part of this disconnect to me is that I look at it year by year, my current year, whereas the formula is going 2 years back.
Mhm.
But nowhere do I see where it ties the 85% to 2 years back. The 85% could be current, and then the formula could be funded on a historical average, say like 95%, knowing that that will yield 85% for the current year. Am I making sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very much.
And
Where do you
then-
get the 10% cut? Where are you reducing that 10%? Just from their,
I just made up the 95.
Oh,
I don't
okay,
know
that
what
was
it
just
would
you,
be.
okay,
It
all right.
might be 90.
whatever it is.
But if we were able to do a ratio like that over time and say, well, for the past several years, this is what the difference has been, then we could say, well, then that means the target figure for this formula has to be 90% to yield 85% for the current year.
Correct.
Then
All in
there's no
favor,
disconnect.
raise your hand.
I'm trying to think how many years of data you need to.
Did you get an average going forward of how
You
much
do a
that's been?
3-year rolling average, maybe.
Hmm.
And so it might change year to year, so next year it becomes 89% to yield 85, and then the following year it's maybe 92% to yield 85.
When do we get audit adjustments?
By any time we do mid-year updates on the numbers. Usually happen in December.
Let us ponder. Have you already run data? You haven't already run data, have you? Let us ponder and run data. We haven't done the fiscal note in a couple months. Let us run one and see how it goes.
It seems reasonable, though.
Okay, so one of the questions I have is why are non-activities included? Because San Juan and myself have to travel forever to go to our activities where people that are,
That's why they get the guarantee.
Guarantee.
San Juan gets, I think, the largest,
Mhm.
260 grand guarantee.
But that's built into the, that's one of the things I first discussed when I first got on though, because that's now been absorbed into the board levy. It was on the chopping block, I believe, my first year, and they were saying, this isn't delineated out, saying we're generating this revenue.
guaranteed.
Ben, do you think that there's any legislative will to re-implement a transportation levy?
Probably not.
I get zero guaranteed.
Yeah.
Because I mean,
That's because your assessed valuations, haven't you went to assessed
Yeah, our
valuations?
valuations are
Like,
off the chart.
Yeah, your assessed valuations keep going up, and this one is, the guarantee is like a tax effort, kind
You
of.
send a McDonald's or a Denny's down.
we're above the board max this next year, so.
And I think the difference there, you know, there's a difference between paying for kids to get to and from school, and then there's one for, you know, optional activities. I think that's kind of where the breakdown comes.
Is it really optional though?
Well,
No,
in theory, we
because
don't,
HSA
you know,
will tell you what you're gonna do.
based on our attorneys, we don't have to pay, you know, transportation is not required. It's not a required benefit of the public school system, and so.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
We could stop transporting
Oh,
kids.
Yes.
Yeah. The only arguments ever made to keep transportation is the equal protection, but that was one of the things that came out this year, is they asked us
So
to
you just
contact
got
our
health
attorneys
insurance
to see
without
what they thought, you know, obviously they'd all have to be challenged in court at some time, but I think that's kind of where you get your breakdown is, you know, what's required to get to and from, and then they created years ago that guaranteed transportation that worked at the time to offset some of those costs of those districts that have to travel far, required you to, you know, raise a tax similar to what the voted in board, and if you generated less than the guarantee amount, then you got money from the program, but that's all gone away, and since that time, that program hasn't been reconsidered, so there's only $500,000 in the pot, and San Juan gets 260,000 of it or whatnot. And so that's where the argument probably needs to be, is we need to, in addition to looking at this to and from component, there's this other transportation cost that should be looked at as well. Do you combine them? Maybe they'd go for that, I don't know. But, or do you try and beef up both of them?
So if there's no mandatory transportation, then why do we have to do 401 or equal access, handicapped access, all the different
ADA,
things?
ADA, 504.
ADA, that's what I was thinking of.
Well, I think it's if you choose to do it, then you must comply. But
By
if you
the
choose
rules.
not to, then you don't have to.
You build a school, you have to build a ramp.
Right?
So
I mean,
Ben,
obviously, it's not a popular thing to get rid of.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I say, yeah, there's not a legal requirement, but there's sure a public relations requirement.
I mean, it might be fun just to go to one of those meetings to see what happens, but.
I think activity trips, a lot of them are educational and get different types of grants that pay for some of that transportation cost. There's also fees for students that a portion of those, if I remember, can go toward transportation. So we're also breaking into some other categories and defining how other funding sources affect, you know, your activity trips.
That's what I kind of half wonder is, you know, and I was talking to Derek about this a little bit, when he says a percentage off a percentage, we're taking our not acceptable, our allowable costs. Eligible costs, and using that as our denominator. Maybe we should be hitting up the legislation and asking some of these questions. Why aren't some of these things allowable costs? Why are these taken out?
Well, it's more than that. Just that what you get first, you take your hack at your eligible costs. That's your first hack. Then you take another hack for your average miles and minutes. So there's another hack. Then there's the third hack, which is the 80%. So really, there's 3 hacks to get to the amount that we're going to get funded.
Well, and each of those hacks are legislatively mandated.
Well, but
So
as-
Hack 1, the only reason we have the word eligible in the discussion is because this is for to, from, not for activities.
Right.
That's a legislative,
Yep.
that wasn't a staff idea, that was a
Yep,
legislative
yep.
idea. Hack 2 is build something into the formula to incentivize efficiency, right? Whether that's the best thing or not, like that's subject to debate, but the direction was find something that incentivizes efficiency, and that's legislatively required. 3 is because there's not enough money to pay the final determination, right?
Which,
And because it's 85%, not 100. Is that, am I on the same
Can-
page?
Can I ask a really simplistic efficiency question? If everybody in the entire system is underfunded, doesn't that inherently cause us to want to be as efficient as possible? I mean, I guess what I would get to is that the 85% in and of itself
encourages efficiency.
encourages efficiencies. Because if I'm only, I mean, anything that I'm below the 85% is just money out of my general fund.
Yep.
So I think you could argue that as long as we are under 100% funded, we are already funding on efficiencies.
Because I don't want to incur
Sure.
costs that I know I'm already going to have to pay some.
So maybe you can eliminate one of the three.
Could I give you an example and you tell me how we should handle it at the state level? So all districts shall remain nameless. We have a district right now that's busing students from another district boundaries to their school. And we
You have
do not
others
pay
there?
for those routes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you probably got a
We,
lot of districts.
we do not pay for those routes
Yeah.
because that doesn't fall within the to, from
Sure.
range. If you move just to total cost,
Yeah.
you would be paying for those routes.
There's some the statute behind this though, because we're actually doing it, so we're the ones, and I'll fully own up to this.
I don't know what you're doing, so let's hear it.
We are driving kids to Duchesne, okay?
Oh.
But that goes back to a 1940s congressional act that says we have to do it, but yet we're not getting funded for it.
It's also a different scenario. I bring kids from Washington County to Iron County because it's shorter distance than going to the nearest school. Am I funded for that? Is that eligible? We have the memorandum of understanding and all
So,
that between us.
that's a great question, and I guess when you talk about funding, do you mean state funding or district funding? Because if you have a memorandum of understanding with Washington School District, it's entirely possible that Washington School District is paying you to transport them.
They could be.
They might not be, but they could be, right? That could be
So
negotiated amongst your
I
districts.
filed those routes on my A1. I gotta know.
Audit.
Yeah, well, I already depend
Well,
on-
and I think that
I've already asked.
these are the kinds of things that we're running into, is in order for us to say this is an eligible route, what are we actually paying for? I think in our perspective, if those students were not your district kids, we've been ineligible-ing that route, right? If you have an MOU with Washington, there's absolutely nothing that precludes you in Washington from working out a payment for transportation. That's totally fine. And I would argue that that's probably what's happening with Duchesne.
So they are not paying us for, so here's what's happening, is they're not paying us for those kids at all. We have to go back to the 1940 Congressional Act, this went all the way up to Congress. And there's a Congressional Act, we had to pay $10 million of their new high school that's being built. We have to bus the kids that are going there from the tribe over there. But they don't pay us for them, and I pay them $300,000 a year in capital just to support their school. But now I don't get funding to bus all those kids there.
Because they're not within your district.
Which
of
sometimes we have
residence.
to be careful with, to me.
But
I mean, this is waste, we're wasting money because it's gonna be cheaper to pay Iron County to bus those kids than it is to pay Washington County where they'd be eligible and.
Well, and I think that that's
We're
why
beyond reason when we sometimes.
that's why the latitude exists, right? Is if it's cheaper for the two districts to enter into an agreement, we don't have any feelings about that. That's totally within the latitude of the LEAs.
Well, let's say they've entered into an agreement. Who submits them for reimbursement?
Well, he just asked which WPU they're on. I don't know that.
Who gets the
Yeah,
WPU?
who claims those kids?
Where they're enrolled.
WPU gets the money.
You would find that.
where they're enrolled.
So you probably get the WPU because they're enrolled, but if you're not submitting them on your request, Washington can't submit them on their request because they're not running the route.
Yep.
So who's submitting the reimbursable request then?
I think it's a question.
And if you submit it and they're not within your boundary and you get denied, this goes to what Natalie was saying. I actually think that we are under claiming what revenue needs to be coming. You know,
We're
I
not
think that.
unique. I know that there's several, and I'll leave them unnamed, but that do the same thing. It's actually closer to go across that border to a high school than an hour and a half to the other one.
Well, and I think that what it feels like to me is that we need to gain an understanding of these things that are happening.
Right.
Instead of having everybody bury them in the deep darkness, we need to know what's going on so that we can, as a group, sit down and decide what's appropriate. What are the guardrails? Is this okay? Is this okay?
And what's the most cost effective?
Right. Exactly. And who should claim them? Right. Like a custody arrangement, right?
And to build on, and to build on your guardrail analogy, you're saying guardrails because that allows for a narrative, not everything just strictly to be driven by a formula, right? I mean, formulas ought to guide us, but then narrative ought to be what polishes up these last things, which is why I think you're saying guardrail as opposed to railway tracks. You know, railway tracks are formulas. They're totally driven, they're totally dictated, you know, it's like being on a roller coaster that's bound to one rail and it never shall vary. And I think that that's gotta be a byproduct of this conversation that, yeah, we got the guardrails that the formulas basically tell us what to do, but then we gotta get to narrative on some of these things. I'm glad we're having the narrative on tint ticket 210%. Who cares? Yeah, I know what the formula spits out, but we don't need to save the state of Utah $14,000 and have Tintic get $30,000 instead of $44,000.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody cares. I mean, we would actually care if the formula hurt Tintic. Would absolutely care. But the way it is right now, yeah, we're perfectly fine with that.
So I guess that's the core question is, what are our short-term and long-term goals? We know long-term, we have work to do on establishing guardrails. That is not news to us. We're aware of that. Short-term, what do we feel comfortable recommending to our peer groups, right? Because I would assume that the outcome of these meetings are that a summary and recommendation goes to the superintendents, one goes to the business administrators, one goes to the transportation groups. And at the end of the day, the expectation is that all of us can get together and make a recommendation to the legislature. Here's what we're comfortable. Here's what we think we have, you know, and I think it's fine if we have short-term and long-term objectives. That's not a problem. Ben can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think in the short term, the question the legislature wants an answer to is, what exactly do you need to get you to the 85% so you're happy?
No.
Or what exactly?
What is the 85%?
Or what is, number one, what is the 85% and how much will it cost us, right?
Yeah.
Those are your two big questions.
Don't you think that his scenario, even running the scenario for the 3-year average, so, because I think that's a valid point. 85% when we're using 2 years ago's cost compared to 2 years later, 85% then is different than 85% now. And I think running those averages, I think would be some information that would be useful to the legislature, especially to the Public Ed Committee.
This isn't the only program that's looking at rolling averages. And we have them established in special ed, primarily to provide stability in funding.
Yeah.
But you know, the charter schools are looking at that for their local replacement.
Well, I think that's an excellent idea, one that should be explored.
So for our next meeting, because it sounds to me like we need two. I don't know if everyone really was planning to stay here till 5. What time is it?
Almost 4.
I would assume you'd want to get out before traffic. So for the next time, I think, one, we'll work with John and do some kind of workup on the 3-year averages. Is that okay with you guys?
In the spirit of transparency, yeah, we were not lying.
Not my shock face. I know.
Except for those of you who came at 2.
That's right.
That's my
we will fix the benefit formula.
Yes.
That's easy peasy. We'll fix that and show you what adjustments that makes to fiscal year 19. What other things would you like to discuss next time? I know this is a lot of information, and sometimes, especially for me, I like to distill and ponder and then come back. Is there any other scenarios, fiscal notes, work group items you want us to work on? What should we talk about next time?
Is there, and again, I'm Sean Camille, I'm a solution to all this, but just from hearing in the room, is there a single, it seems like some folks are entering things and some folks aren't, or maybe counting them differently, like kind of like a base, this is what is supposed to be included in this cell, or this is what's included under the, like definitions for all these things.
We talked about that at the beginning, yeah. That's kind of our long-term.
Well, that was one of the objectives.
Yes.
Part of the problem is, unless you have all the information that Jamie has, going in and calculating this is absolutely impossible. And so we need to find a way to use the reports available to us, be that the AFR or the APR. When I went and did this, I did the APR and noticed it wasn't much. The to and from component of that wasn't much different than the full transportation. So that was the first indicator that to and from costs are not being reported separately from full transportation, which this history has taught me that there was some instruction to bring them together at some point. So I think we need to have that element of, once we decide what the proper way is to calculate this, have some way to communicate that. So if you want to go through and do it for you,
it's accessible for everything. And I just think it's sometimes in the past when I've worked around some of these complicated things where, you know, basically everybody could pull a sheet, and no matter who you were, whether you worked in the legislature or the administration or in a district, you could grab it, and everybody could play around with it and come to the, you know, the way that you're playing with the sheet. Everybody would be able to look at it and come to like a common idea how that sheet was built. With the data.
So everybody has all the. So we don't have all the data online, right? All the A1 data?
Yeah.
Is it all online?
Oh, the A1s? No.
Is there anything in there that could
Because
be
A1s
public?
are individual.
Is there anything in it that's
spreadsheet
public?
from every single.
Activity runs on 2700. It's on the AFR, it has to be reported as a 2700. If you want to try and isolate a subset of 2700, one way to do that really is through an APR or through a mile a minute.
Feels like you'd need
that's
another.
initially why I went to the APR, because it still has a designation for to and from, and so I thought it was being split out, but clearly it's not.
We'll verify back together in years time.
So that was my first venture into this, that there's a problem.
I guess maybe 6, 7 years ago.
We can go back and look, see. We have APRs back for quite a while. We could go back and look and see if we can find when it was consolidated. How much work do you think? I mean, I guess the core question is, do we feel the LEA should record to, from, and activities separate or not?
I wouldn't, because we're already reporting the miles separately. So now to report a different separation just duplicates our effort.
Can you, Derek, can you do me a favor and do some research as to where your activities are showing up? Yeah. And then we can go digging through the data and see if there are other LEAs who are doing the same thing as you. Okay. Because that would disproportionately disadvantage your district if you're recording it somewhere else, and that's not equitable or fair. And we want to make sure to clean those up if we know about them now to resolve that. And I think that's something that if you can give me that data, we can probably do in the next couple of weeks. We'll ask Brett to take care of that. He'll love it. What else? Does anybody have any ideas on the base? Leave it as is?
We should bump it to 75.
I'd say
You asked for an idea.
Well, that's one that we talked about, is it even doing what everyone wanted it to do
I
initially?
think the easiest way to deal with the base would be to exclude it from the calculation of 85%.
Would we have to put that in statute? Would we need to carve that out in the formula?
No, I imagine that the board could do that in rule.
Okay. Well, I would assume by the time we're done, we're gonna have to make rule modifications anyway, right? Okay.
Ben, tell me what you mean by that. Ben, what do you mean by exclude it? Do you mean just go out column 7, or do you mean have it as an unallowable?
No, have it as an allowable, well,
It basically means you'd artificially split the appropriation.
yeah.
And you'd take the base out first, and we'd pay everybody the base, and then that would be its own little thing, and it wouldn't be part of this calculation over here.
Because that's what's causing all these districts to go above 100%.
Would hurt anybody.
Fundamentally, does anybody have
For
heartburn
your
if
district, it
we?
wouldn't have any impact really, because,
No, but I don't want to harm a smaller district.
yeah, and that's the reason why I was thinking, if you pull it out, suddenly Tintic's no longer at 208%.
Right.
And I would like to see what their percentage is without.
Isn't
Well,
our,
they're
it's
80,
just 80.83.
it's 80.83, everyone's at 80.83
Oh, yeah.
then.
Yeah.
See, that's what I.
But just, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Good suggestion.
Somewhere along the line, I hope we can simplify the report. Because some of us that don't have a transportation director, it's a shared responsibility, it's a huge issue to spend that much time on.
We would very much like to do the same thing.
Yes.
It's not awesome for us either.
I mean, I think that's one route, is looking just at a different formula and getting out with the miles and its efficiency gain.
Well, the thing is there's lots of, lots isn't the right word. There are things on the A1 that we're not 100% sure why we care. And we could still get the same information we need for the formula without some of these extraneous items. Is that fair? And that's what work we've been trying to figure out is, do we
Actually need this.
use this data? Like, do we care? Because if we don't care, I don't want to gather stuff anymore. And as we make a recommendation to build a system, I don't want to build a bunch of stuff that we don't need. That's just cost and energy and time.
So why not consider all routes in terms of to and from? So she's pulling kids from Washington, we're sending kids to Duchesne. Duchesne's getting the WPU for those kids. Why can't I get the transportation funding since I drove them? Why can't they get the transportation since they're driving them?
I think one of the weaknesses of the A1 is it's a spreadsheet that's kind of like a railroad track, where it doesn't give you, it doesn't give you the ability to report extra stuff, right? And if there are circumstances that need to be considered so that we can figure out what the right answer is, like a custody arrangement thing, right? Like, we don't know what we don't know. And unless it pops up in an audit, we don't know that answer.
That's exactly what I was saying.
So my idea, if you fund the students to the school bus, Washington
Because we're sending kids
get
to
the money,
Duchesne.
and then they can
Busing them to
reimburse
busing them
that
to
to
Duchesne.
Iron
Your kids.
instead of the bus.
Are you getting money for them or not?
No.
Why do you do that?
Do you keep
Because
the
we
property
have-
tax?
We have a constant, no, we don't have property taxes, we're
No,
right,
'cause
because
they're
it's
on
the
the
tribal
tribe.
lands.
Oh,
Yeah,
Yeah.
his is so.
Oh.
It's so, I mean,
His is,
so.
we might give you a unique flag for that one.
yeah, his is a very.
Hey, if we're talking tribal lands, I want to be involved in that.
So, I mean, you got a bunch
Yeah.
of, like, the tribal land kids, that we're not getting any property taxes.
You don't
on.
get WPU for them
We
because
don't
they're
get
not counted
WPU
in your
for 'em,
membership.
And we're sending, and we're busing them to Duchesne. And we're paying for the transportation costs and the driver wages and everything for them.
But you have the oil.
And a tax rate that's higher than the state max. So,
Natalie, would it be, sorry, appropriate, I guess, in this group to talk about ineligible routes? It's been brought
Sure.
up to the UAPT people that hazardous routes that we fund 100%, that will never go away. who transport kids across a 5-lane highway. They live 3/4 of a mile from an elementary school, but do you want kindergarten kids trying to dodge traffic? So there's things in our district, and that's why I was glad kind of when the whole thing went away.
You just saw Frogger, didn't you?
I don't know how to even bring it up, but it's been brought up to me, is sitting on that board, because there's several rural districts who have the same thing. You know, they transport along rural roads, there'll never be a sidewalk, and yet we want the kids to walk. We don't want the kids to walk. Safety is our first priority, and then we end up funding it at 100% because.
But your urban districts
So-
have more of that than the rural.
From the
I know,
UAPT
it's
perspective.
across the board, but I represent rural districts. I don't.
So this feels to me like something that we may or may not have enough time to deal with in this group. Deal with isn't the right word. Investigate in this group. But that doesn't mean we couldn't look at it. So can you, APT, and Ron work together to put a list of like weird ineligible stuff together so we can sit down and figure that out?
When would you want to have that?
I'll leave that to Ron.
If it's,
He likes it when I surprise him in public
by
meetings.
August.
It's his favorite thing.
Just tell me when the deadline is, right?
I think is.
It would take time for UAPT to.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right. I don't think this is something that's gonna
I
happen
don't
in
think that
2
this
months
is
or
something
3
that's
months.
realistic to revise or have a reasonable recommendation for by the report that's due in August. But I also don't think that we don't want to not talk about it. And I think that, like I said, we've got short range objectives and long range objectives. And we've been working on long range objectives for like as long as I've known Herb, right? So we've been working on, we finally achieved one with a manual. Yay!
Yeah.
Right? And so now we can start going down and kind of working through some of those issues. So I think right now, I'll leave it to you guys to set a time frame. I think it's definitely something we want to talk about though. And I think that the ineligible routes as it relates to specific circumstances that you guys are talking about. I'm sure the other LEAs have other circumstances that we're unaware of, and I think we want to take the time to investigate those. I think that if we could take the next school year to come up with a good set of guidelines so we don't do it in like a gut reaction format and have it ready for the next school year would be a reasonable time frame.
Because if you take a bunch of hazard routes and you throw them in, the pie's no bigger, everybody's reimbursement goes down. So we have to be really careful.
Right. But does it give a truer picture of what transportation costs are actually, what LEAs are actually incurring?
And that's what, all this data that you put on the table makes it easier to go to the legislators and say,
Right.
look, we're underfunded.
Right. Yep. It just proves your case better.
we should make that a major topic in our next UAPT meeting in March.
So can we? So can we go around the table, and if you have thought of anything you want us to work on or topics for next time or things you don't think we got to, can we go around this way? And if you don't have anything right now, but think about something as you're blow drying your hair tomorrow, like email Jamie and Ron.
Let's see, like this, so we're gonna get nothing out of you until then.
He'll call later. He always does.
Yes, he does.
John, do you have anything else you want us to discuss or we didn't get to? I have your 3-year average on our list of things to work on.
I apologize for being late. I don't know if you got to it,
No.
but as far as the allowable object codes that were there, I think there is one in particular that I think should be
300.
allowable. But in my mind, there's one that definitely should not be allowable, and that's just school buses. So if one scenario of looking at this were just take all the object codes, allow them to accept school buses, I think that's reasonable. The one that I think should be allowable is the 300. We have our camera services are coded to 300, and because it's not allowable, that's a big service for you from in my mind.
Okay.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Huge one.
Is that consistent throughout the group?
But I don't mind if the others are allowable. Again, to me, the one that shouldn't be allowable is school buses. Because we're already discounting it based on activity versus to from, I think we've got enough of differentiation there, plus 85%. I think that's pulling it back, school bus station. The other ones are pretty teeny.
Which one is the school buses one? I thought we tossed that one out.
Yeah, it is excluded.
It's excluded, John. Is that what you?
I know,
Yeah.
I'm just saying an
It
option
should
would
stay
be to.
Stay excluded is what.
Oh, okay.
Allow everything except that one.
My only question would be, is there a reason why we couldn't have our sped buses allowed, since we get 0?
Maybe if you could do like that, well, I don't know, if you add a ramp or a lift or anything like that, is that categorized underneath technical services, or no?
If you add a ramp.
Or not a ramp, I'm
lift.
sorry, a
A
lift.
lift. When we buy our buses, we just order with.
What'd you say, John?
We have ramp with equipment.
That's how we purchase. If we have to replace one, it would come out of our equipment budget, which is allowable.
Just okay. But that's not an add-on, you buy the bus with the lift.
That's what we do, that's what we do.
It'd be nice if you could. add that out, I guess.
Do we have any way of knowing what districts are spending on school buses? I'm just thinking
Yeah.
if in the future, the legislature were open to.
We could run a query of that object code and see where else.
See what everybody's doing.
For the VW, I have invoices
Volkswagen
for.
Grant, we have that funding.
I think we ought to figure out some kind of monopoly on that, get together as the entire school district of the state use buses, that's why I say get us on buying buses every year. Because we spend $500,000 on 4 to 5, either route buses or long haul buses, it ends up being about $500,000 every year.
Did you guys buy off state contract?
Mm-hmm.
You guys know that just because somebody's on state contract does not mean they're giving you the best deal you can get.
Yeah, with the VW money and the airshed money, the airshed requires us, because it comes through the EPA to do competitive grants, you can't buy off the state contract. So a bus that was costing me $124,000, because I did competitive bid, is costing me $117,000.
State contract's not always the best deal.
It's not.
So
If you think that, you're up.
Well, to respond to your question, Wyoming actually buys all of their buses. The state buys all of them and distributes them to the school districts. The problem you get into, now you're creating another situation, just like we're talking now, because each school district wants to have something just a little bit different. So in Utah, for example, Alpine wants to have white rims on their bus, and Carbon County wants to have red rims on their bus. And if you buy them all through the state, they can't have their white rims on their bus, and Carbon can't have the red rims. And if you don't think that's a little deal, you should have gone through our. It is a big deal. But all those buses would have to be exactly the same.
Okay, so John, do you have anything else?
I can't solve white rims, but. Herb, do you have anything else you want us to look into?
No, I agree with Allison that we want to talk about eligibility, and there might be some areas where we want to tweak some things. But that probably needs to be a recommendation that comes from UAPT and the directors in the state, and we can talk about that in our conference in March. And create a report for you, and we'll do that. I think that's a good suggestion.
That'll be awesome.
I don't have any question, I just say thank you. This is good, a good base to start from. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry for being late, I thought it was a 2.
Well, first man was set.
But my only thing would be is, and I've been hitting on this whole time, is I think that middle cut with the efficiency is just not
The average.
the averages. I think there's something that needs to be looked at when you have to be essentially below that with my calculations to actually be even close to getting the 80%.
Will you send me your?
What I've done, yes.
Okay.
I just want to say thanks. I appreciate you guys putting this together. This has been eye-opening for me. That YouTube video was good. I've watched it 3 or 4 times, so I appreciate you guys putting that together.
That was a good video.
Helping me to understand this and understand better you know, I'm gonna go back and look a lot more deeply into where we're categorizing our expenses, because I hope we're not shortchanging ourselves like.
Hey, we're told to break it out, so we broke it out.
And please feel free, if you feel that that video would be helpful to other members of your
I'm gonna
groups.
post it on the.
It's on our YouTube channel.
Financial Operations has a
My
YouTube
wife didn't
channel.
like it near as well as I do.
You gave that to her for Mother's Day. That's thoughtful of you.
Superintendent, anything?
I think it's, you know, I think it's good that we can be together and discuss everything, so that's a positive.
Mhm.
On the negatives, I'm not really in favor of Friday meetings nor afternoon meetings, so I don't know what your future's got planned. but-
Well, we tried to accommodate those that are traveling far distances to get here.
I'll
Not-
drive up the night before. But far distances gets
Well,
us home at 9 o'clock at night.
The combination of that and when we could find a room available, every.
Next meeting's at 10.
Yeah.
10 o'clock.
I mean, to that point, I mean, if we could, we ever find space, I mean, if there's a way that we could help
Oh,
find
yeah, we have
space.
space.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, and
We
we've
can host it out if
been,
you
we've
want.
been recording this so that we can put this up for others to listen to. And so that was one of the other reasons is finding a space where, you must have missed that part. Finding a space where we could record these items and broadcast them so people could listen if they wanted to.
It's just a longer road from here to Payson than it is from Payson.
That's true. I'm sorry, apologize.
Our Star Wars room, our Star Wars room.
Can you broadcast from there, though?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's all wired up.
Superintendent, do you have anything else for us? Okay.
Ben?
Ben?
Superintendent?
No, I echo your sentiment, that, you know, just that concept of, I know that state code says we need to look at making sure that we take efficiencies into account, and I think we inherently are taking efficiencies into account. And I think if we could back some of those things out of the formula, it would make it easier for districts to understand and comply. So it might be a simplification factor, similar to what you're sharing as well. So no, thank you. This is a great meeting.
Anything else? Nope. I'm fresh out of ideas.
So I have our next meeting in June 4th at 10 a.m. And we're not in this room. We're actually in our room, so in financial operations. So right as you come in that door, turn right. And we're right in there in 156.
5 p.m.
10 a.m. to 5, yeah.
Wait for someone to come in.
They're actually moving, ooh. So when you come back in June, I think that we will be under construction at that point. They're actually moving our reception area down to the front of financial ops.
People actually come in the building.
Where people come in the building. It's a weird concept, I know. Hey. So I don't know how you're gonna get into our office. We have to like parade you through 2 sets of stairs or something. So just watch for the signs when you come back, because we'll be out there. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for your time.
156. I'll send out a reminder.